Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. We are going to take a famous historical figure, put him under a soft, gentle spotlight, and very calmly dismantle the biggest rumor that has followed him for over 200 years. We are going to talk about Napoleon Bonaparte and the persistent, almost legendary idea that he was an exceptionally short man. It's a myth so powerful it's become a psychological term, the Napoleon Complex. But tonight, we're going to find out it's mostly hot air, fueled by propaganda and a simple, almost comical, measurement mix-up. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a quiet little signal that helps this channel immensely. And while you're at it, go ahead and drop a comment below with your city and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from, sharing this quiet moment across different time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're in Paris. The city lights are soft outside, but you're indoors, in the vast, echoing halls of the Louvre. The daytime crowds have vanished, and the only sound is the gentle hum of the climate control and the soft shuffle of your own feet on the polished parquet floor. It feels like you have the whole place to yourself. You walk through galleries filled with silent marble gods and stoic painted nobles until you arrive in a room that is dominated by a single, colossal canvas. It's Jacques-Louis David's The Coronation of Napoleon, and it's immense. Seriously, it's over 33 feet wide and 20 feet tall. You have to stand way back just to take it all in. The painting depicts the scene inside Notre Dame Cathedral on December 2nd, 1804. It's a spectacle of velvet, silk, and gold leaf. Dozens of figures are crammed onto the canvas, each with a distinct expression, bathed in a grand, heavenly light. And right in the center, poised and dynamic, is the man himself. This is your first real look at him tonight. Napoleon Bonaparte. HES standing on a platform, holding a crown aloft, about to place it on the head of his kneeling wife. You lean in a little closer, squinting at his figure. He looks perfectly fine. HES not a giant, but HES certainly not the tiny, comical figure you might have imagined from old cartoons. In the sea of dignitaries, clergy, and family, he seems entirely in proportion. He holds the absolute center of this universe, his posture radiating a confidence that has nothing to do with physical height. This painting, of course, is a masterpiece of political branding. That's our first stop tonight, a mainstream historical fact. This entire artwork was commissioned by Napoleon to cement his legitimacy as emperor. He wasn't born into royalty. He took power, so he needed to create the symbols of it. This painting was just art. It was a press release in oil paint, designed to be seen by the entire world as proof of his God-given, or at least people-approved, authority. But as you scan the crowd, your eyes land on a serene, elegantly dressed woman seated in the main gallery box, looking on with matriarchal pride. That's Napoleon's mother, Letizia Bonaparte. And here's a little known, wonderfully petty piece of trivia for you. She wasn't actually there. She boycotted the coronation entirely because she had a feud with Josephine and thought the whole imperial affair was ridiculously ostentatious. When Napoleon saw David's initial sketches, he insisted his mother be included. She is the mother of the emperor, he reportedly said. She must be part of the honor. So the artist painted her in, a perfect example of historical photoshopping, 19th century style. Now, looking back at Napoleon, you can't help but wonder if he was so meticulous about his image, so willing to literally rewrite reality on the canvas to include his mom. Wouldn't he also have fudged his own depiction if he were truly self-conscious about his height? This is where historians still have a lively debate. Was Napoleon the ultimate micromanager of his own public image, controlling every brushstroke, or was he a product of propaganda artists like David, who knew exactly how to portray power. The consensus leans toward a collaboration, a perfect storm of a leader who knew what he wanted and an artist who knew how to deliver it. Standing here, in the quiet of the museum, you realize this painting is the official story. It's the polished, imperial narrative. But it doesn't explain the rumor. The rumor of the short, angry little man was born here, in the gilded halls of Paris. It was born in a much grittier, much more hostile environment, across the English Channel. And it had nothing to do with art, and everything to do with war. To find the source of that myth, we have to leave the grandeur of the Louvre behind and travel back a few years, to a time before the crown, when Napoleon was just a boy from a strange island, trying to find his place in a world that didn't want him. The polished floors at the Louvre dissolve, and the scent of old paint and varnish is replaced by something wilder. You can smell salt on the air, mixed with the fragrant, herby scent of a sun-baked hillside. This is the smell of the Marquise, the dense, stubborn scrubland of Corsica. Gillray and Ajaccio, his hometown. It's a world away from Paris. The buildings are sun-bleached stucco. The streets are narrow, and the language you overhear is a sharp, musical dialect of Italian, not French. This isn't a place of emperors. It's a rugged island with a history of rebellion etched into its very mountains. This is where he begins. And he isn't Napoleon Bonaparte yet. He is Napoleon Bonaparte, a boy with an Italian name, from a family of minor Italian nobility who found themselves on the wrong side of a geopolitical transaction. Here's a core piece of history that explains everything about his early years. Just 1 year before his birth in 1760, the Republic of Genoa, which was broke, sold the entire island of Corsica to France. The Corsicanese, who had been fighting for their independence, were furious. They were now French subjects by decree, not by choice. So you have this boy, born French on paper, but Corsican in his blood, his accent, and his soul. He is an islander, looking out at the vast mainland that has just swallowed his homeland. At the age of 9, his father, a savvy political operator who decided it was better to join the new French rulers than fight them, secured him a scholarship. You find yourself standing in the chilly, damp courtyard of a military academy in Brienne-le-Château, in northern France. And you see him, a small, serious-looking boy, thin and sallow, surrounded by the sons of French aristocrats. They are taller, fairer, and infinitely more confident. They laugh easily, they're French smooth and effortless. And then there's him, Napoleon. His French is thick with a Corsican accent. His name sounds foreign and strange to their ears. You can feel the alienation radiating off him like a winter chill. The other boys mock him relentlessly. They call him La Bellonnaise, which translates to straw in the nose, a cruel taunt mimicking his pronunciation of Napoleon. He is poor. His family's noble title is barely recognized, and he is a constant reminder of France's newest, most unruly acquisition. He doesn't play their games. Instead, you see him retreating into himself, finding solace not with his peers, but in the library. He devours books on history, geography, and, most importantly, mathematics. In the world of numbers and artillery tables, there is no accent. There is only logic, precision, and merit. An answer is either right or wrong. It's a refuge from the messy, unfair world of social hierarchy. This intense isolation leads him to a fascinating, almost paradoxical phase of his life. And here's your quirky bit of trivia for the night. Far from being a budding French patriot, the young Napoleon was a fervent Corsican nationalist. He idolized Pasquale Paoli, the leader of the Corsican resistance who had been defeated by the French. He spent his free time writing passionate essays and even a history of Corsica, dreaming of the day he could return and lead his people to freedom from the very country whose military uniform he was wearing. It's a wonderful irony. The man who would one day become the ultimate symbol of French glory started out as a teenage revolutionary who wanted to break Corsica away from France. This brings us to a question that historians still love to unpack. How much did this experience as a bullied, isolated outsider directly forge the man who would conquer Europe? Was his insatiable ambition a direct, psychological reaction to the slights he suffered as a boy? One school of thought, leaning into psychophistory, argues yes, absolutely. They paint a picture of a man with a colossal chip on his shoulder, spending the rest of his life trying to prove himself to the French aristocrats who mocked him. Every victory, every new title, every conquered territory was, in this view, an act of supreme revenge against the boys in the schoolyard. But other historians find this a bit too neat, a bit too much like a movie script. They argue that while his personality was certainly shaped by his youth, his rise was more a product of circumstance. He was a man of immense talent and ambition who happened to come of age at the precise moment the old world was shattering. The French Revolution tore down the very aristocratic structures that had excluded him, creating a power vacuum where a man of talent, regardless of his background, could rise. Was he driven by a deep-seated need for vengeance, or was he a brilliant opportunist who seized a once-in-a-millennium chance? The truth, as it often does, likely lies somewhere in the murky middle. As you watch him hunched over a book in the corner of that cold library, you can see both sides. You see the heart, the pride, the fierce intelligence. He is forging himself into a weapon, though he doesn't yet know what war he will be fighting. The other boys see a strange, unsociable foreigner. They have no idea they are mocking a mind that will one day redraw the map of their entire world. The revolution is just a few years away, a storm gathering on the horizon. And this brooding young artillery cadet, this outsider, is uniquely prepared for the chaos to come. His first great test is just around the corner, in a besieged port town in the south of France. The musty scent of the school library gives way to the sharp, briny air of the Mediterranean coast, but this time it's laced with the acrid smell of gunpowder and mud. You're in Toulon, a crucial port city on the southern coast of France, in the autumn of 1793. The French Revolution is in full, chaotic swing, and the situation here is a mess. Royalist rebels, loyal to the old monarchy, have taken over the city and, in a move of desperation, invited their supposed enemies, the British and Spanish navies, into the harbor to protect them from the revolutionary armies. For the new French Republic, this is a disaster. They absolutely have to retake Toulon. The French siege camp is a miserable place. It's a sprawl of muddy tents and demoralized soldiers. Their artillery commanders are, to put it politely, incompetent. Their cannons are in the wrong places. Their shots are falling harmlessly into the bay, and the British ships are sitting comfortably in the harbor, mocking them. The entire campaign is stalled. Into this scene of frustration and ineptitude steps a 24-year-old artillery captain, dispatched here more by chance than by design. Then, intense, with piercing gray eyes that seem to take in everything at once. This is Napoleon Bonaparte. You watch him as he surveys the situation. While the senior generals are fixated on attacking the city itself, he instantly grasps the tactical reality. His Corsican upbringing, his islander's perspective, makes him see the terrain differently. He understands that the key isn't the city, it's the harbor. And the key to the harbor are the promontory, the high ground overlooking the water. You can almost see the geometric lines of fire calculating in his mind, a problem he has been solving on paper since he was a boy in Brienne. He argues, passionately and relentlessly, that if they can capture a specific point of high ground called Forte Ligileti, they can rain down cannonballs on the British fleet, forcing them to either flee or be sunk. His superiors, stuffy old guard generals, initially dismiss him. Who is this scruffy, young upstart with a weird accent? But his logic is undeniable, and the situation is desperate. they give him his chance. He works with a furious energy, a whirlwind of motion. You see him wading through mud to reposition cannons himself, sleeping in the open beside his batteries, and personally aiming the guns. He gathers every piece of artillery he can find, creating a massive battery that the soldiers will call the battery of the men without fear. His own horse is shut out from under him, and he receives a minor bayonet wound to his thigh, but he is utterly relentless. This is the mainstream historical point. The siege of Toulon was Napoleon's star-making performance. It was where he first demonstrated his military genius on a major stage. When his plan is finally put into action, it works exactly as he predicted. The French forces storm the key forts. The British admiral, Lord Hood, sees the writing on the wall. With French cannons now commanding the heights, his fleet is a sitting duck. He gives the order to evacuate. The British ships sail out. The royalist cause collapses, and Toulon falls back into Republican hands. For the revolutionary government in Paris, it's a stunning victory, and they want to know who is responsible. The name that comes back is Bonaparte. He is promoted from captain to brigadier general overnight. He has arrived, and it's here, amidst the mud and camaraderie of the siege, that he earns his most famous nickname. This is your wonderfully human piece of trivia for the night. You see him talking with his gunners, a tight-knit group of grizzled, veteran soldiers. They are older, bigger, and tougher than he is, but they adore him. Why? Because he is one of them. He doesn't just give orders from a tent. He lives with them. He eats their rations. He aims the cannons alongside them. In a moment of affectionate respect, they start calling him the petit caporal, the little corporal. Now, this is the absolute crux of the height myth. To modern ears, the little corporal sounds like a direct comment on his stature. But in the context of the French Revolutionary Army, it was anything but. A corporal was a non-commissioned officer, a soldier's soldier. By calling him their little corporal, these huge, battle-hardened veterans were essentially saying, he is a general, but he is one of us. He is our guy. It was a term of endearment, a badge of honor that signified his closeness to his men. The petty part was not a literal measurement. It was a term of affection, like calling a beloved friend, my little brother, even if he is taller than you. It conveyed familiarity and love, not a physical description. But of course, that nuance would be completely lost in translation, especially when filtered through the lens of hostile British propaganda a decade later. This leads to a fascinating historical debate. Did Napoleon actively cultivate this man of the people image, or was it a natural consequence of his leadership style? Some historians argue that he was a master of political theater even then, consciously creating a bond with his troops because he knew he would need their loyalty. They point to how he would later use the nickname in his own bulletins, understanding its power. Others argue that it was entirely genuine. He had spent his life as an outsider, and for the first time, in the company of these soldiers, he had found his tribe. He felt more at home with them than he ever had with the aristocrats at school or the politicians in Paris. The debate is rich because both sides feel true. He was a man who craved loyalty and knew how to earn it, but he also genuinely respected the common soldier. As you watch him celebrate with his men after the victory, a rare smile on his face, you see the birth of the Napoleonic legend. It's a legend forged not just in strategic brilliance, but in a shared bond between a general and his troops, summed up in a simple, affectionate, and catastrophically misunderstood nickname. His victory at Toulon has put him on the map. Now HES headed for the epicenter of the revolution, Paris. The grit and gunpowder of Toulon fade away, replaced by the chaotic, intoxicating, and dangerous atmosphere of post-revolutionary Paris. The reign of terror has just ended with Robespierre's execution, but the city is still jittery. The guillotine has been dismantled, but the political ground is constantly shifting, like quicksand. One day you're a hero of the Republic, The next, you're an enemy of the state. It's a city of immense opportunity and equally immense peril. You find yourself in the heart of this turmoil, where fortunes are made and lost not on the battlefield, but in the perfumed, candlelit drawing rooms, the famous Parisian salons. After his triumph at Toulon, you'd think Napoleon would be set for life. But this is revolutionary France. His rapid promotion made enemies, and his association with the Robespierre faction, now out of power, made him politically suspect. He is briefly arrested, and though HES released, his star has dimmed. He finds himself a general without a command, wandering the streets of Paris, his uniform growing threadbare, his future uncertain. He is, once again, an outsider. Too Corsican for some, too radical for others, too ambitious for everyone. He spends his days in cheap cafes, writing novellas and contemplating a future that looks increasingly bleak. This is where you see a different side of him. Not the military genius, but the political networker. He understands that to get back in the game, he needs connections. He begins to frequent the salons. These were the social hubs of the new Paris, hosted by influential women, the merveilleuses, who had survived the terror and were now setting the tone for a new, more decadent society. He met in a room buzzing with energy. The men are politicians, bankers, and army contractors. The women are dressed in daring, Greco-Roman style gowns, witty and powerful in their own right. And into this world of intrigue and influence walks the lean, hungry general from Corsica. You watch him navigate this environment. At first, he is awkward. He is not a smooth talker. His clothes are wrong. He is more comfortable with a cannon than a canapé. But he has an intensity that is magnetic. When he speaks, he does so with a quiet, confident authority that cuts through the frivolous chatter. He does some gossip. He talks about artillery, Italian geography, and the political situation with a clarity that is mesmerizing. And in one of these salons, hosted by the powerful pallbearers, one of the 5 directors now ruling France, he meets the woman who will change his life, Josephine de Beauharnais. Here's the essential historical context for this chapter. The period of the Directory was notoriously corrupt and unstable. The government was weak, and power was held by a small circle of men like bearers, who were more interested in enriching themselves than in governing. They were desperate for a military man they could control, a sword to protect their shaky regime from both royalist uprisings and radical mobs. They just hadn't found the right one yet. In Josephine, Napoleon finds his key to this world. She is older than him, a widow with 2 children whose aristocratic husband had been guillotined during the terror. She is the ultimate insider, effortlessly charming and well-connected. She is Barre's former mistress and a central figure in Parisian high society. You can see the attraction. For him, she is a symbol of the grace, elegance, and social standing he lacks. For her, this intense, brilliant young Jamo represents security and the future. Their relationship is a whirlwind romance, a mix of genuine passion and calculated ambition on both sides. And this leads to a fantastic, slightly embarrassing piece of trivia about their early relationship. Napoleon was utterly besotted. He wrote her a series of passionate, almost cringe-worthy love letters, both before and after their marriage. He would write things like, "I awake full of you. Your image in the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures has left no rest to my senses." He called her by the pet name Josephine, though her real name was Rose. He essentially rebranded her. While he was away on his first Italian campaign, he would fire off these letters constantly, begging for her to write back and complaining bitterly when she didn't. Many of these letters survive, and they offer a stark contrast to his public image as a cold, calculating commander. He was, at his core, a hopeless romantic. The nature of their relationship, however, is a point of endless debate among historians. Was it a true love story or a marriage of convenience? The romantics point to those passionate letters and the undeniable chemistry they share. They argue that despite her infidelities and his later ambition which led him to divorce her, there was a deep and lasting bond between them. The cynics, on the other hand, argue it was a pragmatic alliance from the start. He needed her connections. She needed his protection and rising star. Her relationship with Paris, they claim, was the key. Marrying his ex-mistress was a way for Napoleon to secure the patronage of the most powerful man in France. The truth is probably a messy, human combination of both. As you watch them together in a salon, you see the transaction, but you also see the spark. She smooths his rough edges, teaches him how to dress, and introduces him to the right people. He, in turn, offers a future that is more exciting than anything she could imagine. It's through this partnership that he gets his next big break. In October 1795, a royalist mob threatens to storm the Directory's government building. Paris panics. He needs a general who can handle the streets. He remembers the intense young man who cleared the British out of Toulon. He remembers his mistress's new protégé. He gives Napoleon the command. Napoleon, in turn, unleashes his famous swift of grape shot, ruthlessly mowing down the rebels with cannon fire in the middle of Paris. He saves the Directory. His reward, command of the French army in Italy. His journey to the Alps is about to begin. The decadent, perfumed air of the Parisian salons evaporates, and you are hit by a blast of freezing alpine wind. The world turns to shades of white and gray. You are high in the maritime Alps, the jagged spine of mountains separating France from the Italian plains. Below you, a line of ragged soldiers snakes its way through a treacherous pass. Their uniforms are worn thin, their shoes are falling apart, and they haven't been paid in months. This is the French army of Italy in early 1796, and it is, by all accounts, a basket case. Demoralized, poorly equipped, and neglected by the government in Paris, you see their new commander, the 26-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte, riding among them. His own generals, seasoned veterans older and more experienced than he is, are deeply skeptical. They see a young political appointee from Paris, someone who got the job not through merit, but through connections and a bit of street violence. They are ready to dismiss him, to passively resist his command. They've seen commanders like him come and go. But then he speaks. Yori standing in his semicircle of soldiers as he addresses them for the first time. His voice isn't loud, but it has a sharp, metallic quality that cuts through the wind. He doesn't offer them empty platitudes. He looks them in the eye and speaks to their reality. Soldiers, he says, his voice ringing with promise. You are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much. It can give you nothing. He acknowledges their misery. And then, he points south, towards the unseen, sun-drenched plains of Italy. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. It's a masterclass in motivation. He isn't asking them to fight for an abstract revolutionary ideal. He is offering them a deal, a contract. Follow me, suffer a little longer, and you will be rewarded with tangible things, food, wealth, and fame. You can feel the shift in the atmosphere. The sullen, resentful soldiers start to look at him differently. They see not a politician, but a leader who understands them. This is the mainstream historical point. The first Italian campaign was the crucible where Napoleon's military legend was truly forged. He took a broken army, through sheer force of will and strategic genius, turned it into an unstoppable force that humbled the Austrian Empire and its allies. He moves with lightning speed. His motto is l'audacie, toujours l'audacie, audacity, audacity, always audacity. He keeps his forces concentrated, while his enemies, the Austrians and their Piedmontese allies, have their armies spread out. He attacks the scene between them, defeating them one by one before they can unite. You are a blur of motion, rushing from one battlefield to the next. Monty Nut, Bilzamo, Digo. Victories pile up so fast that the news can barely keep up in Paris. Then you find yourself on the banks of the Ade River, at the town of Lodi. The Austrians are retreating across a long wooden bridge, protected by a hail of cannon fire. A frontal assault seems suicidal. His generals advise him to wait, to find another way across. Napoleon dismisses him. He knows that at this moment, the psychological impact of a daring victory is worth more than the lives it might cost. He grabs a standard and personally leads his grenadiers in a mad charge across the bridge, straight into the mouths of the Austrian cannons. This moment, the Battle of the Bridge of Lodi, is your quirky historical detail. Objectively, it was a hugely significant strategic victory. The Austrians were already in retreat. But for Napoleon's personal mythology, it was everything. He would later say, "It was only on the evening of Lodi that I believed myself a superior man, and that the ambition came to me of executing the great things which so far had been occupying my thoughts only as a fantastic dream." It was here he truly began to believe he was a man of destiny. His soldiers, awestruck by his personal bravery, solidified his nickname, Le Petit Caporal, their little corporal who would charge headfirst into enemy fire. As you follow his astonishing campaign through Italy, capturing Milan, besieging Mantua, crushing one Austrian relief army after another at Castiglione and Rivoli, you witness his developing style. H.E.S. not just a general, H.E.S. a head of state in the making. He negotiates treaties, founds new republics, and plunders Italy's finest art treasures, sending them back to the Louvre in Paris. This raises a question that historians still debate. Was Napoleon a liberator or a conqueror? The official narrative he promoted was that he was bringing the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and an end to feudalism, to the oppressed people of Italy. And to some extent, he did. He swept away ancient, stagnant aristocratic regimes and introduced modern laws and administration. Many Italians, especially among the middle class, initially welcomed him as a liberator. But on the other hand, this liberation came at a steep price. He imposed heavy taxes, conscripted thousands of young Italians into his army, and ruthlessly suppressed any dissent. The liberty he offered was on his terms and always served the interests of France first. Was he a revolutionary idealist or a pragmatic predator? An enlightened modernizer or a sophisticated bandit? The argument continues because the evidence supports both interpretations. He was a complex figure who genuinely believed in many enlightened principles, but was also driven by a boundless ambition and a cynic's understanding of power. As you watch him ride in triumph into Milan, hailed by cheering crowds even as his agents are cataloging which Da Vinci paintings to ship to Paris, you see this contradiction in sharp focus. He has secured France. He has made himself a national hero. But in doing so, he has also made a powerful, implacable, and very, very annoyed enemy. An enemy just across the water, who is watching this meteoric rise with growing alarm. The sun-drenched Italian plains dissolve into a damp, persistent gray drizzle. The scent of olive groves is replaced by the smell of wet wool, coal smoke, and the sea. You are now in London. The mood here is starkly different from the revolutionary fervor of Paris or the operatic drama of Milan. It's sober, resolute, and deeply suspicious. In the coffee houses around Fleet Street and the hallowed halls of Parliament, all the talk is of one man, Bonaparte. You're sitting in on a session in the House of Commons. The chamber is packed, the air thick with debate. A politician, perhaps William Pitt the Younger himself, is at the dispatch box, his voice ringing with indignation. H.E.S. not talking about a general. H.E.S. talking about a monster, a Corsican ogre, the very embodiment of the French Revolution's chaos and ambition let loose upon the stable, ordered world of old Europe. To the British, Napoleon isn't a hero who rewards his soldiers. He is a plunderer who strips nations of their art. He isn't a liberator. He is a tyrant who replaces one form of despotism with another. This is the core historical context you need to understand. For Great Britain, the conflict with revolutionary and later Napoleonic France was more than just a geopolitical rivalry. It was an existential and ideological struggle. Britain saw itself as the defender of liberty, their version of it, at least constitutional monarchy and parliamentary rule, property, tradition, and global trade. France, in their eyes, represented anarchy, atheism, radicalism, and a rapacious military expansionism that threatened the entire balance of power in Europe and, crucially, Britain's lucrative overseas empire. Napoleon was simply the terrifyingly effective new face of that threat. You wander out into the bustling London streets. The newspapers and print shops are doing a roaring trade. Every news report from the continent is eagerly consumed. His victories in Italy are reported not with admiration for his military skill, but with rising panic. He seems unstoppable. The British public, fed a steady diet of patriotic news, begins to see him not as a man, but as a caricature of evil. He is the bogeyman. Mothers might tell their children, "Be good, or Boney will come and get you." This fear and animosity gave rise to a fascinating and uniquely British form of resistance: propaganda. And here's your quirky historical detail for the evening. The British government heavily, though often secretly, subsidized a thriving industry of political cartoonists and pamphleteers whose sole job was to mock, belittle, and demonize Napoleon. This was just a few isolated artists. It was a concerted, nationwide propaganda effort. They understood that you could fight a war not just with ships and cannons, but with ink and paper. The goal was to destroy his mystique, to turn this figure of awe into a figure of ridicule. You see these prints displayed in shop windows, drawing crowds of laughing, pointing Londoners. They are savage, brilliant, and brutally effective. And it's here, in these cartoons, that the myth of his height truly begins to take root and flourish. The artists needed a simple, visual way to portray him as contemptible. So they drew him as a tiny, petulant child, a miniature tyrant stamping his feet in a giant, oversized hat. He would be shown as little Boney, a diminutive figure being disciplined by the tall, heroic figure of John Bull, the personification of England. Or he'd be depicted as a tiny man trying to hop across the English Channel, or being held in the palm of King George I's hand. This visual shorthand was incredibly powerful. It didn't matter what his actual height was. In the British popular imagination, he became small, the nickname his own soldiers used with affection. Le Petit Caporal was seized upon and twisted. The British press, either through genuine misunderstanding or, more likely, deliberate misinterpretation, presented it as literal proof that even his own men thought he was episcopal. The nuance was completely stripped away, leaving only the insult. This leads to a debate that historians of media and propaganda still grapple with. How much did this propaganda campaign actually influence the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars? Did a cartoon ever stop a cannonball? The traditional military historian might say, not much. Wars are won by battles, blockades, and economic strength. The British Navy and the Duke of Wellington won the war, not some artist in a London attic. But a cultural or social historian would argue that this view is too narrow. They would contend that the propaganda was absolutely vital for maintaining British morale and political will over 2 decades of relentless, ruinously expensive warfare. These cartoons and pamphlets kept the public unified and resolute. They dehumanized the enemy, making it easier to send sons to fight and to pay the crushing taxes required. By making Napoleon seem ridiculous rather than invincible, they made the long, arduous struggle seem winnable. It was the weapon against Napoleon's army, but it was a powerful defense against doubt and war weariness on the home front. As you stand in the London Rizzle, looking at a crude drawing of a tiny Napoleon throwing a tantrum, you realize you are at the source. This is ground zero for the myth. It wasn't born from a medical report or an eyewitness account. It was a wartime invention, a caricature cooked up to serve a political purpose. It was designed to make a giant of a man seem small. And one of the most brilliant and vicious purveyors of this myth was a man named James Gillray, whose work we'll look at next. The misty, rain-slicked streets of London sharpen into a specific, cluttered interior. You are now in a print shop just off Street James S. Street, a place buzzing with creative and acidic energy. The air smells of ink, copper plates, and paper, and colored prints are drying on lines strung across the room like laundry. This is the workshop of James Gillray, the undisputed master of the political cartoon, the Rembrandt of caricature. He is the man, more than any other, who will craft the visual identity of little Boney for the British public. You see him at his workbench, a portly man with spectacles perched on his nose, hunched over a copper plate, meticulously etching lines with a sharp tool called a burin. He works with intense concentration, but there's a glint of malicious glee in his eye. He is not just an artist. He is a political commentator, a satirist, and, in many ways, one of Britain's most effective weapons in the war against France. Gillray's work is not subtle. It's visceral, often grotesque, and wickedly funny. He takes the raw ingredients of news and rumor and cooks them into a potent visual stew. This is the central historical point of our visit here. James Gillray and his fellow caricaturists were not fringe figures. They were at the very heart of British political life. Their prints were eagerly awaited and discussed by everyone from the king in his palace to the common man in a pub. They shaped public opinion in an age before photography or television, acting as the primary source of visual news for the masses. You watch as he works on one of his most famous creations. It's titled The Plum Pudding in Danger. The print shows a round dining table, which is actually a globe of the world. On one side sits the British Prime Minister, William Pitt, tall, thin, and severe. On the other side sits Napoleon, and this is your first good look at Gillray's version of him. He is minuscule. His feet barely dangle off the chair. He has a huge, bicorn hat that seems to weigh him down, a comically long sword, and a greedy, hawk-nosed face. He is the perfect picture of a pint-sized, grasping tyrant. In the print, Pitt is calmly carving himself a slice of the globe-labeled ocean, while Napoleon is frantically hacking off a huge chunk labeled Europe. The message is clear, simple, and devastatingly effective. Now let's zoom in on a quirky, and rather specific, detail of these caricatures. Gillray and others developed a whole visual vocabulary for Napoleon. One of the most common and strangest was the recurring theme of boots. They almost always drew him in enormous, oversized black cavalry boots. Sometimes the boots are so big they seem to come up to his chest. This served multiple purposes. Firstly, it further emphasized his supposed smallness, the little boy playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Secondly, the heavy, stomping boots became a symbol of his militarism, his desire to trample all over the liberties of Europe. It's a fantastic example of how a simple, repeated visual motif can become a powerful piece of propaganda, condensing a complex political idea into a single, memorable image. The little man in the big boots. The effectiveness of these cartoons was so great that, according to legend, Napoleon himself was aware of them and deeply angered by them. He is reported to have said of Gillray, "He did more than all the armies of Europe to bring me down." Well, this quote is almost certainly apocryphal, a bit of British self-congratulation. It speaks to a deeper truth that historians still debate. Did propaganda like Gillray's cross a line from political satire to dangerous dehumanization? One camp argues that this was all part of the rough-and-tumble political discourse of the 18th and 19th centuries. Satire is meant to be savage, and in a time of war, the enemy is fair game. Gillray was just doing his patriotic duty, using his unique talents to bolster the nation's spirit. They see him as a champion of free speech, holding power to account with his pen and ink, even if that power was a foreign dictator. But another perspective suggests that Gillray's work, and the industry it represented, created a template for modern wartime propaganda that has had darker consequences, by turning a human adversary into a monstrous or ridiculous caricature, a Corsican ogre or a demonic imp. It makes it easier to justify extreme measures against him and the people he leads. This style of dehumanization, they argue, can poison political discourse and make peaceful resolution more difficult. Was Gillray a patriot or a purveyor of hate speech? A defender of liberty or a pioneer of the dark arts of propaganda? The answer depends heavily on your perspective and where you draw the line between satire and slander. As you look around the cluttered workshop, you see sketches for other cartoons. Napoleon as a spider spinning a web over Europe. Napoleon as a monkey. Napoleon as a screaming baby having a tantrum. In every single one, he is tiny. The image is being stamped, again and again, into the public consciousness. It's a lie, a caricature, but it's a sticky one. It's so much easier to remember and repeat than the complex truth. But Gillray and his fellow artists had an unwitting accomplice in cementing this myth, an accomplice born not of malice, but of a simple, mundane difference in how two nations measured the world. And to understand that, we need to pull out a ruler. Let's leave the chaotic, ink-stained world of Gillray's workshop and step into a calmer, more cerebral space. Imagine a quiet study, lined with books and scientific instruments. On a large wooden desk, two rulers are laid side by side. One is a standard British imperial ruler, marked in inches. The other is a slightly more ornate French ruler from the pre-revolutionary era, the taille du roi, or king's foot, marked in its own units, paces. At first glance, they look similar, but if you look closely, you'll see the secret ingredient to this whole historical misunderstanding. The French inch, the pace, was longer than the British inch. This is the linchpin of the entire myth, the seemingly boring, technical detail that provided the proof for what the British cartoonists had been drawing all along. The mainstream historical fact is this: the old French system of measurement, before the metric system was widely adopted, was different from the British imperial system. Specifically, the French foot pide was about 79 inches, and it was divided into 12 French inches paces. This means that one French pace was equal to about 7 centimeters, while a British inch was only about 54 centimeters. It doesn't sound like much, but when you multiply it by a person's height, the difference becomes significant. Now, let's do the math. When Napoleon died on Street Helena in 1821, his personal physician, a Frenchman named Doctor, he measured the body from head to heel and recorded the height as 5 peeds, 2 paces. This was in French units. Now, if you are a British official or journalist in 1821, and you see that number, you're not thinking about the nuances of antiquated French royal measurement systems. You just read it straight. You see 5 feet, 2 inches. Let's be honest. 5'2" is objectively short for a man, even by the standards of the early 19th century. This fact spread like wildfire. It was the confirmation everyone in Britain was looking for. See, we were right all along. The tyrant was a tiny little man. The cartoonists felt vindicated. The politicians felt smug. The rumor was now hardened into a seemingly scientific, verifiable fact, straight from the autopsy table. But it was a simple, classic case of being lost in translation. If you take Tom March's original measurement of 5 beats and pulses and convert it correctly into the British imperial system, you get a height of approximately 5 feet 6, 5 inches, or about 1/16 meters. The average height for a French male at that time was around 5 feet 5 inches. So far from being a short man, Napoleon was actually slightly taller than the average Frenchman of his era. He was perfectly average, maybe even a little above average. This brings us to our weird piece of trivia for the night. The confusion around measurement in the 18th and 19th centuries was absolutely bonkers. It was just a French versus British issue. Before the metric system standardized everything, almost every country, and in some cases every region or city, had its own system of weights and measures. A pound in Amsterdam was different from a pound in London. A German ell of cloth was a different length from a Spanish vara. It was a complete and utter mess that made trade, science, and international cooperation a nightmare. The metric system, which was one of the lasting administrative achievements of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic era, was a radical attempt to solve this chaos by creating a universal system based on logic and nature. The meter was originally defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator. It's a supreme irony that Napoleon, a great champion of this new, logical system of measurement, would have his personal legacy so thoroughly distorted by the confusion of the old one. This whole episode of the inch versus pouch debacle raises a question that historians and even scientists still debate. How much does our unconscious bias influence how we interpret data? In this case, the British had a strong confirmation bias. They were already primed by years of propaganda to believe Napoleon was short. So when the autopsy data came in, they didn't question it or check the units. They saw what they wanted to see. The data fit their preconceived narrative, so they accepted it uncritically. Some historians argue this was a deliberate, cynical act of misinformation, knowingly twisting the facts to score a final posthumous point against a dead rival. They believe the British authorities knew full well about the difference in measurement systems, but chose to ignore it because the 5-foot story was just too good to pass up. Others take a more charitable view, suggesting it was an honest mistake born of ignorance and cultural chauvinism. They argue that the average person in London simply wouldn't have known or cared about the intricacies of the French pied de roi. They weren't being malicious, they were just being provincial. Regardless of intent, the damage was done. The number 5'2" was now attached to his name forever. The myth now had two powerful pillars holding it up: the visual propaganda of the British cartoonists and the seemingly hard evidence of the autopsy report. It was a perfect storm of caricature and miscalculation. But the story of Napoleon's public image was just being forged in the mud of battlefields and the print shops of London. It was also being shaped in a far more exotic location, under the shadow of monuments thousands of years old. The quiet, intellectual atmosphere of the study dissolves. You're hit by a wave of dry, oppressive heat, and the air is thick with dust and the scent of exotic spices. The sky above is a brilliant, unforgiving blue. You are standing on the banks of the Nile River in 1798. In the distance, rising from the hazy desert floor like geometric mountains, are the pyramids of Giza. This is the French invasion of Egypt, one of the most audacious and strangest chapters in Napoleon's career. After his stunning success in Italy, the Directory in Paris was faced with a problem: what to do with a hugely popular, dangerously ambitious young general. They couldn't afford to have him sitting around in Paris, soaking up the adoration of the crowds. They needed to get him out of the way. Napoleon, for his part, was already dreaming bigger than just another European campaign. He was looking east, dreaming of emulating his hero, Alexander the Great. He proposed a bold plan, an invasion of Egypt. This is the key historical context. The expedition to Egypt served two purposes. For the Directory, it was a way to exile their most popular general to a faraway isle and where he hopefully wouldn't cause any trouble. For Napoleon, It was a grand strategic gamble. The official goal was to disrupt Britain's land route to its most valuable colony, India, and to establish a French presence in the Middle East. But his private goals were far grander. He envisioned creating a new Eastern Empire, perhaps even marching on to India itself. It was a project born of equal parts strategic calculation and romantic fantasy. So you find yourself with the French army, having narrowly dodged the British fleet led by the relentless Horatio Nelson. You witness the Battle of the Pyramids, where Napoleon, ever the master of motivation, allegedly told his troops, "Soldiers, from the tops of these pyramids, 40 centuries of history look down upon you." His disciplined French squares of infantry easily repelled the charges of the brave, but technologically outmatched Mamluk cavalry. It was a swift, decisive victory on land. But just a few weeks later, disaster strikes. You're on the coast, near Alexandria, when news arrives. Nelson has found the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay and has utterly annihilated it in the Battle of the Nile. In a single stroke, Napoleon and his entire army of 35. Their men are cut off. They are stranded in Egypt, with the British Royal Navy controlling the Mediterranean. They are masters of Egypt, but they are also prisoners there. This predicament leads to the truly unique and quirky aspect of the Egyptian campaign. Napoleon didn't just bring soldiers. He brought an entire corps of 167 civilian experts, scientists, engineers, botanists, artists, linguists, and historians. They were called the savants. While his army was fighting, this Institute of Egypt was busy measuring, mapping, sketching, and studying every aspect of the country. They collected plant and animal specimens, studied ancient hieroglyphs, and cataloged the temples and tombs of a civilization that had fascinated Europeans for centuries. It was during this scientific expedition that one of his soldiers, Pierre-François Bouchard, stumbled upon the single most important discovery of the entire campaign, the Rosetta Stone. You see it for yourself, a broken slab of dark granodiorite, being used as building material in a fort. But an officer notices that it's covered in 3 different scripts: Ancient Greek, Demotic, and, most tantalizingly, Egyptian hieroglyphs. They instantly recognize its potential significance. The Greek, they could read. If the other 2 scripts said the same thing, this stone could be the key to finally deciphering the mysterious language of the pharaohs, a puzzle that had stumped scholars for over 1,000 years. The stone became the most prized possession of the savants. The ultimate fate of the Egyptian campaign brings us to a historical debate. Was the expedition a brilliant success or a colossal failure? From a purely military perspective, it was a disaster. Napoleon failed to achieve his strategic goals. He was forced to abandon his army and sneak back to France in a small ship, dodging British patrols. The army he left behind was eventually defeated by the British and Ottoman forces and had to surrender. In the terms of surrender, they were even forced to hand over their antiquities, including the Rosetta Stone, which is why it sits in the British Museum today, not the Louvre. However, from a cultural and scientific standpoint, the expedition was a monumental success. The work of the savants was compiled into a multi-volume masterpiece called The Description d'Egypte, a comprehensive survey that effectively launched the modern science of Egyptology. It opened up ancient Egypt to European eyes in a way that had never been seen before. It created a wave of Egyptomania across Europe and America, influencing art, architecture, and fashion for decades. So, who won? Was it a French scientific triumph masked by a military failure, or a British military victory that came with a priceless archaeological prize? The answer really depends on what you value more: military conquest or scientific knowledge. Napoleon himself, a master of public relations, managed to spin the whole affair as a victory. When he landed back in France, he was greeted as a conquering hero. The news of his initial victories had arrived, But the news of his fleet's destruction and his army's eventual surrender was delayed and muffled. He controlled the narrative. He returned from the east covered in a mystical, exotic aura. He was the man who had walked with pharaohs. And he arrived back in Paris at the perfect moment, just as the corrupt and incompetent directory was on its last legs, ripe for a takeover. The dusty, sun-baked landscape of Egypt vanishes in a flash. You are back in Paris, in the autumn of 1799. The city is tense and full of whispers. The directory, the five-man committee that has been governing France, is a complete failure. The economy is in shambles. The treasury is empty, and the French armies in Europe are suffering defeats. The government is paralyzed by corruption and infighting. The French people are weary of a decade of revolution, chaos, and uncertainty. They long for stability, for a leader who can restore order and national pride. The situation is ripe for a coup d'etat. Into this power vacuum steps Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh off the boat from Egypt. As we saw, he has managed to frame his eastern adventure as a resounding success, arriving just ahead of the bad news. He is welcomed by cheering crowds. He is, by far, the most popular man in France. He has the one thing the politicians lack, the adoration of the people and the loyalty of the army. You can feel the electricity in the air. Everyone knows something is about to happen. This is the essential historical backdrop. The coup of 18 Brumaire, which corresponds to November 9, Yao Qi Zhou, in the new revolutionary calendar, was not Napoleon's idea alone. It was an inside job, instigated by a group of prominent politicians, including one of the directors himself, Emmanuel Joseph C.S. C.S. was a veteran of the revolution who had decided the directory was unsalvageable. He wanted to stage a coup to create a new, more authoritarian government, one run by sensible, elite technocrats like himself. But he had a problem. He was a thinker, a writer, not a man of action. He needed a military partner, a sword to provide the muscle and intimidate any opposition. He looked at the available generals and settled on the ambitious, popular, and, he thought, controllable Napoleon. It was a spectacular miscalculation. You find yourself a fly on the wall in a dimly lit Parisian townhouse where the conspirators are meeting. The plan seems simple enough. They will use the threat of a fictitious Jacobin plot as a pretext to move the legislative councils out of Paris to the nearby Chateau de Saint Cloud, supposedly for their own safety. Once there, surrounded by loyal troops under Napoleon's command, the councils would be persuaded to dissolve themselves and appoint a new, three-man consulate to run the country. Napoleon and another conspirator, Dugas, would be the three consuls. The first day of the coup goes smoothly. The plot is announced, and the councils agree to move. But on the second day, at St. Cloud, things start to go horribly wrong. You are in the chamber of the Council of 500. It's a scene of pandemonium. The deputies are not the frightened sheep the conspirators expected. They are angry, suspicious, and they can smell a rat. They start shouting down Napoleon Bonaparte, refusing to vote. Into this hostile environment, Napoleon himself decides to make a dramatic entrance. It's a disaster. He is a brilliant general on the battlefield, but he is a terrible politician in a debating chamber. He strides into the hall, flanked by a few grenadiers, and tries to address the council. He is met with a furious roar of outrage. Down with the dictator. Outlaw him. They scream. They see his soldiers and interpret it as a military threat. They surround him, shoving and yelling. For a moment, it looks like he might be physically attacked. He freezes, unused to this kind of opposition. He turns pale and has to be escorted out of the chamber, shaken and unnerved. The coup is on the verge of collapse. And here we get to our wonderfully dramatic, almost comical, piece of trivia. With Napoleon faltering, it is his younger brother, Lucien, who saves the day. Lucien rushes outside to the palace guards, who are waiting uncertainly. He climbs onto a horse, draws his sword, and points it dramatically at his brother Napoleon's chest. He swears a theatrical oath that if his brother ever betrays the principles of the revolution, he, Lucien, will be the first to stab him. It's a piece of pure political theater, but it works. He tells the soldiers that assassins inside the chamber have tried to kill their general. The guards, who adore Napoleon, are enraged. Their hesitation vanishes. On Lucien's command, they fix their bayonets, and a column of grenadiers, led by General Murat, marches into the legislative chamber. The deputies, faced with cold steel, panic and flee, some of them famously climbing out of the windows in their haste. The coup is saved by the bayonet. This chaotic and slightly farcical event leads to a persistent historical debate. Was the coup of 18 Brumaire the end of the French Revolution or its fulfillment? One side argues that this was the day liberty died. Napoleon, a military dictator, used force to overthrow a democratically elected if flawed government. He snuffed out the messy, vibrant, and ultimately democratic spirit of 1789 and replaced it with an authoritarian regime that would eventually become an empire. For them, Brumaire is a tragedy, the moment the revolution devoured itself. The other camp argues the opposite. They contend that by 1799, the revolution had descended into chaos, corruption, and endless war. It had failed to deliver its promises of stability and prosperity. Napoleon, they argue, didn't destroy the revolution. He saved it. He preserved its core gains, the abolition of feudalism, legal equality, religious toleration, while jettisoning the radical instability of the terror and the incompetence of the Directory. He was the strong leader needed to consolidate the revolution's achievements and give France the order it craved. As you watch the last of the deputies scramble out of the windows of St. Cloud, leaving the chamber empty except for a few triumphant soldiers, you can see the merits of both arguments. An era of democratic experimentation has just ended at the point of a sword, but a new era of stability, order, and, eventually, glory is about to begin. That night, a rump of the council is rounded up and forced to vote in the new government. Napoleon Bonaparte is no longer just a general. He is the first consul of France, the most powerful man in the country. The path to the imperial throne is now wide open. The chaotic, makeshift atmosphere of the coup at St. Cloud gives way to an overwhelming scene of calculated grandeur. You are standing inside the vast, cavernous space of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris on a chilly December day in 1804. The cathedral has been completely redecorated for the occasion. The stone walls are draped in velvet and ermine. The air is thick with the scent of incense, and thousands of candles glitter, their light catching on the gold thread of military uniforms and the diamonds of elaborate jewelry. This is not just a ceremony. It is the most magnificent piece of political theater Europe has seen in centuries. You are witnessing the coronation of Napoleon as Emperor of the French. He is no longer first consul. He has consolidated his power, rewritten the Constitution, and, after a carefully managed plebiscite, been declared the hereditary emperor. This event is the culmination of his journey. The boy from Corsica, the ostracized cadet, the penniless general, is about to place himself on a par with the oldest royal houses of Europe. This is the core historical point. The coronation was a masterpiece of symbolic propaganda, designed to legitimize a regime that had no traditional basis for its authority. Napoleon was a usurper, a self-made man who had taken power, not inherited it. He needed to create an instant tradition, a visual spectacle so overwhelming that it would cement his rule in the public imagination. Every detail of the ceremony was meticulously planned by Napoleon himself to send a specific message. He chose Notre Dame over the traditional coronation site of Reims to break with the old Bourbon monarchy. He incorporated elements from ancient Rome laurel wreaths, eagles and the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne to link himself to grand, imperial predecessors. leapfrogging over the more recent and discredited French kings. You watch the procession. It's a stunning display of the new imperial court. His family, once minor Corsican nobles, are now princes and princesses. His marshals, many of them sons of barrel makers and innkeepers, are now dukes and barons of the empire. It's a meritocracy dressed up in the robes of an aristocracy. At the heart of it all is Napoleon, looking regal in his ermine-lined velvet robes. And then comes the moment everyone is waiting for. Pope Pius VI is present, a reluctant guest who was persuaded to travel from Rome to lend the ceremony religious sanctity. Traditionally, it would be the Pope who would place the crown on the new monarch's head, symbolizing that his power comes from God, with the Church as the intermediary. The Pope picks up the magnificent new crown, ready to perform his duty. But then, Napoleon does something audacious, something that sends a shockwave through the cathedral. He takes the crown from the Pope's hands. He turns his back on the altar, faces the congregation, and, with his own two hands, places the crown firmly on his own head. This is the single most defining moment of the ceremony. He is making a clear, unambiguous statement. My power does not come from God or the Church. It comes from my own achievements, my own will, and the will of the French people. He is his own source of authority. He is a self-made emperor. He then picks up a smaller crown and gently places it on the head of his kneeling wife, crowning her empress. It's a moment of surprising tenderness amidst the epic display of power. Now for a wonderfully quirky and slightly vain piece of trivia about the event. Napoleon was, as we've established, intensely conscious of his image. While not exceptionally short, he was a towering figure either. For his coronation, he and his official painter, Jacques-Louis David, employed a few visual tricks. You might notice in David's famous painting of the event that the altar is on a raised platform, and Napoleon is standing on the very top step, which gives him a few extra inches of elevation over everyone else. Furthermore, he insisted on wearing a classical Roman-style laurel wreath of golden leaves for much of the ceremony before the crowning itself. This not only linked him to the Roman emperors, but also added a bit of verticality to his silhouette. Even his choice of a slim, athletic coronation outfit, rather than the bulky robes of previous kings, was designed to create a more streamlined, imposing figure. The symbolism of the coronation, particularly the act of self-crowning, has been endlessly debated by historians. Was this an act of supreme arrogance or a profound political statement about the nature of modern secular power? The traditionalist view sees it as the ultimate expression of his ego. It was an insult to the Pope, a rejection of tradition, and a clear sign that he was a tyrant who answered to no higher authority. For them, it was a moment of hubris that foreshadowed his eventual downfall. However, another school of thought interprets the act very differently. They argue it was a revolutionary gesture, a definitive break with the divine right of kings that had underpinned the old monarchies. By crowning himself, Napoleon was asserting the principle of popular sovereignty. That power ultimately resides with the people who had, in theory, approved his title in a plebiscite and is vested in a leader based on their merit and actions, not their bloodline. In this view, he was just crowning himself. He was crowning the achievement of the French Revolution, creating a new kind of monarchy for a new century. As the Te Deum swells through the cathedral and the heralds cry, Vive l'Empire, you are witnessing the birth of an empire. The Republic is officially dead. But Napoleon's work of transformation is far from over. He has just given France a new leader. He is about to give it a new, unified, and enduring system of laws that will outlast all of his military victories. The pomp and pageantry of the coronation fade, replaced by a much quieter, more scholarly scene. The glitter of crowns and diamonds gives way to the rustle of paper and the scratching of quill pens. You are now in a council room at the Tuileries Palace. A group of stern, bewigged lawyers and jurists are seated around a long table. At the head of the table, presiding over the meeting with an intense, focused energy, is Napoleon himself, still in his role as first consul, before he became emperor. They are not planning a battle or designing a new uniform. They are debating the finer points of contract law, inheritance, and civil rights. This may seem less dramatic than a cavalry charge or a coronation, but what is happening in this room is arguably Napoleon's most enduring legacy. You are witnessing the creation of the Code Napoleon, or the Napoleonic Code. This is the central historical point. Before Napoleon, France's legal system was a chaotic and bewildering mess. It was a patchwork of different laws and traditions that changed from region to region to region. In the north, they used a system based on Germanic customary law. In the south, they used a system based on ancient Roman law. Add to that a tangle of royal decrees, church laws, and local feudal customs, and you had a system where, as Voltaire famously quipped, a traveler in France changed laws as often as they changed horses. The revolution had swept away the old laws but had failed to create a coherent new system to replace them. Napoleon, with his orderly, logical mind, saw this legal chaos as an intolerable offense against reason and efficiency. He wanted a single, unified set of laws for all of France. He assembled the finest legal minds in the country and drove them relentlessly. He personally presided over more than half of the sessions of the council, astonishing the learned lawyers with his quick grasp of complex legal issues and his common-sense approach. He would cut through their jargon-filled debates with sharp, practical questions. Is it just? Is it useful? How would it work in practice? The result, enacted in 1804, was the Civil Code. It was a revolutionary document. It swept away all the old, confusing laws and replaced them with a single, clear, and accessible legal framework. It was written in plain, concise French that any literate citizen could, in theory, understand. It enshrined some of the most important principles of the Revolution: equality before the law for all male citizens, the abolition of feudal privileges, freedom of religion, and the right to choose one's profession. It protected property rights, which was crucial for the rising middle class. It was a secular code, based on reason and logic, not on religious doctrine or historical precedent. Now, for our quirky detail, we must look at a part of the code that is, by modern standards, deeply problematic and reveals a lot about Napoleon's personal views. While the code was a giant leap forward for legal equality in many respects, it was a significant step backward for women's rights. The code enshrined the husband as the absolute head of the household. A wife owed her husband obedience. She could not sign a contract, start a business, or sell property without his permission. The code made divorce possible, but was much more difficult for a woman to obtain than for a man. This patriarchal view was a direct reflection of Napoleon's own rather traditional, almost Corsican, perspective on family and gender roles. He once remarked during a debate on the subject, "The angel told Eve to obey her husband. It is a constant in nature." It's a stark reminder that even the most forward-thinking great men of history are still products of their time, with blind spots that can seem glaring to us today. This dual legacy of the code, progressive in some areas, regressive in others, fuels a continuous historical debate. Was the Napoleonic Code an instrument of liberation or one of social control? One side hails it as a beacon of modern jurisprudence. They argue that by providing legal certainty, protecting property, and ensuring equality before the law, the code unleashed enormous economic and social energy. It became the model for legal systems across Europe and around the world, from Italy and the Netherlands to Poland and even Latin America. It is, in this view, Napoleon's greatest gift to civilization, a tool that broke the back of feudalism and paved the way for the modern nation-state. The opposing view is more critical. While acknowledging its modernizing aspects, these historians argue that the code was also a powerful instrument for imposing a centralized, authoritarian state. By standardizing the law, it erased local customs and traditions, strengthening the power of the central government in Paris. And, as we've seen, its treatment of women and its reinforcement of patriarchal authority were deeply conservative. Furthermore, they point out that while it preached equality, it was a very specific kind of equality that primarily benefited property-owning men of the bourgeoisie. You watch Napoleon in that council room, jabbing his finger at a draft of a clause, arguing a point with the jurists. You see both sides of the debate in action. You see his passion for logic, order, and merit. But you also see his desire for control, for a society that is well regulated and hierarchical, with everyone in their proper place. The code was like the man who created it, brilliant, modern, and efficient, but also authoritarian and traditionalist in its view of social order. It was a legal machine designed to run an empire. And that empire was about to reach its absolute zenith on a frozen battlefield in Central Europe. The quiet, intellectual intensity of the council chamber dissolves, and you are hit by a blast of frigid air. A pale, wintry sun is struggling to break through a thick blanket of fog. You are standing on a rolling, frost-covered landscape near a small Moravian town called Austerlitz. On December 2nd, Weaponized. It is the one-year anniversary of Napoleon's coronation, and he is about to receive the ultimate anniversary gift. Below you, in the fog-filled valleys, you can just make out the dark masses of three enormous armies, a combined force of nearly 160 men. This is the Battle of Austerlitz, the Battle of the Three Emperors. It is the moment Napoleon's military genius will shine its brightest. The situation is this. The new coalition, the Third Coalition, has been formed against him. The vast armies of Austria, led by Emperor Francis I, and Russia, led by Tsar Alexander I, have joined forces. They are confident. They outnumber Napoleon's grand army, and they believe they have him trapped. Napoleon, however, has been meticulously setting the stage for this confrontation for weeks. This is the core historical point. Austerlitz was not a lucky victory. It was a perfectly designed and executed trap, a masterpiece of strategy and deception. You see Napoleon riding along his lines the night before the battle. The fog is thick, and the mood is tense. His soldiers, celebrating the anniversary of his coronation, spontaneously light torches of twisted straw, creating a river of fire that illuminates the night. They cheer Vive l'Empire. As he passes, from the hills above, the Allied commanders, the Tsar and the Austrian Emperor, watch this display. They interpret it as the French army burning its camp, preparing for a desperate retreat. This is exactly what Napoleon wants them to think. For days, he has been feigning weakness. He has pulled back his troops, abandoned a strategically important piece of high ground called the Pratzen Heights, and has even sent envoys to the Allied camp feigning a desire for peace negotiations. He is projecting an image of an army that is overextended, exhausted, and on the verge of collapse. The Allies, led by the arrogant and overconfident young Tsar Alexander, take the bait completely. Their battle plan is simple. They will launch a massive attack on Napoleon's seemingly weak right flank to cut off his retreat route to Vienna. To do this, they will have to march their main force down from the Pratzen Heights, effectively abandoning the high ground that dominates the center of the entire battlefield. You are with Napoleon on his command post on the morning of the battle. The fog is so thick you can barely see. You can hear the rumble of the Allied army moving in the valley below, just as he predicted. He is calm, almost serene. He holds his main forces back, hidden by the terrain and the fog. He waits, and waits. Then, as the Allied left wing commits to its attack, the sun of Austerlitz begins to burn through the mist, revealing the Pratzen Heights, now dangerously depleted of enemy troops. Napoleon turns to his marshals and says, "While they are marching to surround my right, they will present their flank to me. Now is the moment." He gives the order. Marshal Sully's corps, which has been hiding at the base of the heights, surges forward out of the fog. a blue tide of infantry, and storms up the slopes. The Allied commanders are stunned. An entire French army corps has appeared as if from nowhere, right in the center of their position. The battle for the heights is furious, but the French momentum is unstoppable. They seize the high ground, effectively splitting the Allied army in two. Napoleon has captured the key to the battlefield. Now for a slightly gruesome, but fascinatedly weird, detail of the battle's aftermath. As the Allied left wing, now trapped between the French army and a series of frozen lakes, begins to rout, thousands of Russian and Austrian soldiers flee across the ice. Napoleon, seeing this, orders his artillery to fire not at the men, but at the ice itself. Cannonballs smash into the frozen surface, shattering it. Men and horses plunge into the freezing water. For centuries, the story was that thousands upon thousands drowned in this horrific fashion. However, modern archaeology and a re-examination of the evidence have changed this view. When the ponds were drained years later, they found very few human remains, though they did find many cannons and horses. It seems Napoleon's propaganda machine greatly exaggerated the number of drownings to make the victory seem even more total and devastating. The reality was horrific enough, but the legend was even worse. This leads to a classic historical debate. Was Napoleon a strategic genius, or just incredibly lucky? The genius school of thought points to Austerlitz's Exhibit A. They argue that every element of the battle shows his supreme mastery of warfare. The careful intelligence gathering, the brilliant deception, the psychological manipulation of his opponents, the perfect timing of his central thrust, and his ability to inspire his men to heroic efforts. For them, Austerlitz is a work of art, a symphony of destruction composed and conducted by a master. The lucky school of thought, while not denying his talent, puts more emphasis on other factors. They argue that he was facing deeply flawed opponents. The Allied command was divided, with the cautious Austrian generals clashing with the reckless young Tsar. Their plan was clumsy, and their execution was poor. They suggest that Napoleon's plan was incredibly risky. If the fog hadn't lifted, or if Marshal Soult's attack had faltered, the French army could have been crushed. They argue that Napoleon was a high-stakes gambler who, at Austerlitz, had the dice roll in his favor. As the sun sets on the battlefield, the scene is one of total French triumph. The remnants of the Russian and Austrian armies are in full retreat. Napoleon rides among his cheering, exhausted soldiers. He has just crushed the Third Coalition and established his military dominance over the continent. It is his greatest victory, the one he would be proudest of for the rest of his life. His empire is now at its peak, a glittering edifice of power and glory. And it's time to take a look at the life he built for himself inside that empire. The chilling air and the grim aftermath of the Austerlitz battlefield melt away, replaced by the warmth of crackling fireplaces and the scent of beeswax's polished floors. You are now inside the opulent, sprawling palace of Fontainebleau, one of Napoleon's favorite imperial residences. The sound of cannons is replaced by the rustle of silk gowns and the quiet murmur of courtly conversation. We are leaving the battlefield behind to take a peek behind the curtain, into the daily life of the emperor. After Austerlitz, Napoleon was the master of Europe. He had created a new imperial court, complete with all the pomp and protocol of the old monarchies, but with a distinctly different flavor. It was a court filled with his family, whom he had made kings and queens of various European states, and his marshals, the rough-hewn soldiers who had risen with him and were now nobles. This is the main historical context for this chapter. The Napoleonic court was a fascinating and often awkward blend of boorish, efficiency and extravagant imperial display. It was an attempt to create an instant sense of legitimacy and grandeur. You get a glimpse of the emperor's daily routine. It is relentless. He is a workaholic of legendary proportions. His day begins early, often at 7 a.m. He drinks his coffee, quickly scans reports, and then begins a whirlwind of activity that would exhaust a normal man. He dictates letters and orders to a relay of secretaries, his mind moving so fast they can barely keep up. He presides over council meetings, meets with ministers, and micromanages every aspect of his vast empire, from the budget of a small town to the grand strategy of his armies. He famously said, "I have a taste for founding, not for possessing." He was constantly in motion, a whirlwind of administrative energy. His meals are a reflection of this impatience. Unlike the elaborate, hours-long feasts of the old French kings, Napoleon eats incredibly quickly. You watch him at dinner. He often finishes the entire meal in under 15 minutes. His chefs are in a state of constant stress, as they never know exactly when he will decide to eat. The food must be ready to be served at a moment's notice. Guests at his table are often left with their plates still full as the emperor stands up, signaling the end of the meal. He has no time for idle chatter or culinary indulgence. There is an empire to run. This brings us to our quirky, and very humanizing, piece of trivia for the night. Despite the grandeur of his palaces and the formality of his court, Napoleon had a rather juvenile and often bizarre sense of humor. He was a notorious prankster. He enjoyed pinching people, a sign of affection, apparently, and his pinches could be surprisingly painful. His wife Josephine, his sisters, and even his state chamberlains were frequent victims. He also had a fondness for telling ghost stories to the ladies of the court late at night, trying to frighten them, and would sometimes sneak up on people in the dark corridors of the palace. Perhaps his most peculiar habit was his love of taking incognito walks through Paris with his Grand Marshal, dressed as a simple bourgeois. He seemed to get a genuine thrill from mingling anonymously with his subjects and listening to what they were really saying about their emperor. Life at court was not always easy, however, which leads to a historical debate about the nature of his rule. Was Napoleon a modernizing, meritocratic leader or just another despot surrounded by sycophants? The argument for him as a modernizer points to the fact that his court, while lavish, was not entirely closed off. Talent could still rise. The brilliant administrator or a brave soldier could find themselves elevated to the highest ranks of the state, regardless of their birth. He rewarded merit, and his government was, for the most part, efficient and well run by a cadre of talented ministers. He was the enlightened despot in its purest form. The counter-argument is that as his reign progressed, he became increasingly isolated and surrounded by yes-men. He grew intolerant of dissent. His family, whom he had placed on thrones across Europe, were often incompetent and squabbled constantly, causing him endless headaches. His court became a gilded cage where genuine criticism was rare, and flattery was the currency of advancement. His marshals, now rich and titled, grew comfortable and lost some of the revolutionary fire that had propelled them to victory. In this view, he fell victim to the classic trap of absolute power, slowly losing touch with reality as he was surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. You can see both truths at Fontainebleau. You see the brilliant, tireless administrator poring over maps and reports late into the night. But you also see the stifling protocol, the forced formality, and the nervous glances of courtiers desperate to stay in the emperor's good graces. The energy that created the empire is still there, but it is now encased in a rigid, golden shell of its own making. This glittering, powerful, but ultimately brittle empire would soon face its first major crack, not in a grand battle against emperors and kings, but in a bloody, protracted, and inglorious struggle against a nation of peasants and priests. The Spanish ulcer is about to open. The opulent, controlled world of the Fontainebleau Palace dissolves into a starkly different landscape. The manicured gardens are replaced by sun-scorched, rocky hills and dusty, impoverished villages. You are in Spain, the 1808. The air is tense with a simmering, resentful anger. Napoleon, at the absolute height of his power, has just made what he would later call one of his greatest mistakes. He has bullied the Spanish king into abdicating and has placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. He thought it would be a simple matter of political reshuffling. He was disastrously wrong. You are in Madrid on the 2nd of May. Yobalimba. The common people of the city, outraged by the presence of French troops and the perceived abduction of their royal family, have risen up in a spontaneous, furious rebellion. They attack the French soldiers with kitchen knives, farming tools, and old hunting muskets. It's a brutal, chaotic, street-level explosion of violence. The French, under Marshal Murat, respond with ruthless efficiency, putting down the uprising with cavalry charges and firing squads. This event, immortalized in Goya's famous paintings, is the spark that ignites a nationwide inferno. This is the crucial historical context. The Peninsular War, as it came to be known, was unlike any war Napoleon had fought before. In Italy and Germany, he had fought against conventional armies. He would win a decisive battle. The enemy king would sue for peace. Then the war would be over. But Spain was different. After the Spanish army was defeated, the war didn't end. It had just begun. The Spanish people themselves refused to submit. This was the birth of a new kind of warfare, a kind for which the French army was completely unprepared. They called it guerrilla, or little war. You find yourself with a French patrol marching through the desolate Spanish countryside. The silence is unnerving. There is no enemy army to be seen. But you are being watched. From the hills, from behind rocks, from the windows of seemingly abandoned farmhouses. A sniper's shot rings out, and a soldier falls. A supply convoy is ambushed and disappears. A small garrison in a remote town is overwhelmed and massacred in the night. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere. They are not soldiers in uniform. They are peasants, priests, and bandits, united by a fierce hatred of the French invaders. This leads us to the grim and unique aspect of this conflict, our strange detail for tonight. One of the most terrifying figures for the French soldiers in Spain was the priest. In a deeply Catholic country, the local clergy often became the leaders and organizers of the resistance. They preached a holy war against the godless Frenchmen, who represented the atheistic ideals of the revolution. These priests would not only inspire the guerrillas but would sometimes fight alongside them, trading their crucifix for a musket. For a French soldier, used to a secular worldview, being hunted by armed monks and warrior priests in the mountains of Spain was a surreal and terrifying experience. It was a clash of civilizations, not just armies. The war in Spain became, as Talleyrand famously called it, the Spanish ulcer. It was a bleeding wound that would not heal. It slowly and relentlessly drained Napoleon's empire of its most valuable resources, men and money. He had to station hundreds of thousands of his best troops in Spain, trying to pin down an enemy that would never stand and fight a decisive battle. It was a quagmire, a war of atrocities on both sides, that brutalized the French army and tarnished Napoleon's image of invincibility. This brutal reality fuels a major historical debate. Was the Spanish resistance a heroic, popular uprising for national liberation, or was it a reactionary, fanatical movement manipulated by the old guard? The traditional narrative, especially in Spain and Britain where the Duke of Wellington's army would eventually intervene, paints the guerrillas as heroes. They were simple patriots fighting for their king, their faith, and their country against a foreign tyrant. They are seen as the pioneers of modern nationalist warfare, a people in arms rising up to defend their homeland. A more revisionist interpretation, however, offers a more complex picture. While acknowledging the popular nature of the uprising, these historians point out that it was also an intensely conservative movement. The guerrillas were fighting not just against the French, but against the modern, secular ideas of the French Revolution that the French brought with them. They were fighting to restore the power of the absolute monarchy and the Catholic Church, institutions that were, in many ways, holding Spain back. In this view, the war was not just a struggle for liberation. but also a fierce reaction against modernity itself. It was a tragic conflict where the forces of progress arrived in the form of a foreign invader, and the forces of national identity were tied to a deeply traditionalist and reactionary worldview. As you watch a French column burn a village in retaliation for an ambush, you see the futility and horror of this new kind of war. Napoleon himself came to Spain to take command briefly, winning battles as usual, but as soon as he left, the little war started up again. He could not be everywhere at once. The ulcer was spreading. He had vastly underestimated the power of nationalism, not just as an idea for the French, but as a force that could be turned against them. He was about to make the same mistake again, on a much grander, much colder, and much more catastrophic scale. He was beginning to plan his invasion of Russia. The hot, dusty plains of Spain fade into a vast, flat, and eerily empty landscape under an immense sky. It is the summer of 1812. You are marching with the largest European army ever assembled, the Grand Army, over 500,000 men strong, drawn from every corner of Napoleon's empire. The scale of it is almost unimaginable. The column of soldiers, cannons, and supply wagons stretches for miles, and it is marching east, into the endless expanse of Russia. The mood at the beginning of the campaign is one of supreme confidence. This is the ultimate showdown. Sir Alexander I, his former ally from Austerlitz, has been defying Napoleon's continental blockade against Britain. Napoleon has decided he needs to be taught a final, decisive lesson. He believes it will be a repeat of his earlier campaigns. He will march into Russia, fight a huge battle, defeat the Russian army, and force the Tsar to sue for peace. He famously told his ambassador, "The whole thing will be over in a month." It would be his most catastrophic miscalculation. This is the core historical point. The Russian campaign of 1812 was not lost in a single battle, but through a combination of logistical collapse, environmental hardship, and a brilliant Russian strategy of attrition. The Russian commander, Barclay de Tolly, understood he could not defeat Napoleon in a straight fight, so he adopted a scorched earth policy. As the Grand Army advanced, the Russians retreated, refusing to give battle, and as they retreated, they burned villages, destroyed crops, and poisoned wells. They lured Napoleon deeper into the heart of their vast country, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point. The Grand Army was not being defeated by the Russian army. It was being defeated by the sheer size and emptiness of Russia itself. You march for weeks under the hot summer sun. The dust is choking. Water is scarce. Disease, especially typhus, begins to sweep through the ranks. The horses, without enough fodder, begin to die by the thousands, crippling the army's mobility and supply cavalry. The great army begins to melt away before a single major battle is even fought. The soldiers, expecting a quick and glorious war, become demoralized. They have marched hundreds of miles and have nothing to show for it but an empty horizon. Finally, just before Moscow, the Russians, under pressure from the Tsar to make a stand, turn and fight at a village called Borodino. You are there. It is one of the single bloodiest days of the entire Napoleonic Wars. It's a battle of pure, head-on slaughter. The French win, in the sense that they capture the battlefield at the end of the day. But it is a Pyrrhic victory. They suffer horrific casualties, and the Russian army, though battered, is not destroyed. It is able to retreat in good order. A week later, Napoleon enters Moscow. He expects to find a delegation of city elders ready to surrender and offer him the keys to the city. Instead, he finds a ghost town. The Russians have evacuated almost the entire population. And then, that night, the fires begin. This is the truly surreal and bizarre moment of the campaign. Russian agents, or perhaps just retreating citizens, set fire to the city. Moscow, a city built mostly of wood, goes up in a spectacular, terrifying conflagration. Napoleon, The conqueror finds himself the master of a smoldering ruin. He sits in the Kremlin, surrounded by a sea of fire, waiting for a peace offer from the Tsar that never comes. He waits for 5 weeks. It is a fatal delay. As he waits, the Russian winter begins to creep in. Finally, in mid-October, he realizes no peace offer is coming. He has no choice but to retreat. The retreat from Moscow was one of the most horrific episodes in military history. The cold is unimaginable. Temperatures plummet to 30 degrees below zero. The General Winter, as it came to be called, attacks the army with a ferocity no human enemy could match. This is where a famous historical debate arises. Was it the winter or the Russian army that truly destroyed the Grand Army? The traditional narrative, popularized by Napoleon himself in an attempt to save face, blames the weather. He was defeated not by men, but by an unprecedented, freakishly early and severe winter. It was an act of God, an elemental force against which no genius could prevail. This version of events emphasizes the scenes of soldiers freezing to death in their sleep, of men driven to madness by the cold. However, many military historians argue this is a self-serving myth. They contend that the army was already shattered before the worst of the winter even set in. Malnutrition, disease, and the exhaustion from the summer march had already destroyed its discipline and cohesion. The constant raids by Russian Cossacks and partisans during the retreat were what truly broke the army's back. They harried the retreating column relentlessly, picking off stragglers and capturing supplies. In this view, the winter was the final, brutal nail in the coffin. But the coffin had been built over the preceding 5 months of strategic and logistical failure. You are on that retreat. The world is a nightmare of snow, ice, and wind. The proud soldiers of the Grand Army are now a ragged mob, shuffling through the snow, wrapped in whatever rags they can find. The road is littered with the frozen bodies of men and horses. The retreat is a long, drawn-out agony. Of the more than 500 thorough men who marched into Russia, fewer than 50, there will stumble back out. It is a disaster of biblical proportions. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility is shattered forever, frozen in the Russian snow. The nations of Europe, who have chafed under his rule for years, see their chance. The end is beginning. The frozen, nightmarish landscape of the Russian retreat slowly thaws, and you feel the warm, gentle breezes of the Mediterranean. The sky is a cheerful blue, and the air smells of citrus groves in the sea. You are on the island of Elba, a small, sun-drenched speck of land off the coast of Tuscany. It's beautiful, peaceful, and utterly insignificant. And it is now the entire empire of Napoleon Bonaparte. After the disaster in Russia, the tide turned against him with stunning speed. The nations of Europe, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, joined Russia and Britain in a new, final coalition. Napoleon, with his genius, managed to raise a new army of raw recruits and fought one last, brilliant campaign in Germany in 1813. But his resources were depleted, and his new soldiers were no match for the veteran armies of the Allies. He was cornered, defeated at the massive Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, and forced back into France. The Allied armies invaded France itself, and in the spring of 1814, Paris surrendered. His own marshals, weary of endless war, confronted him at the Palace of Fontainebleau and forced him to abdicate. This is the key historical context. The Allied powers faced a dilemma. What do you do with Napoleon Bonaparte? They couldn't execute him. That would make him a martyr. They couldn't imprison him in a normal prison. His legend was too powerful. So they came up with a creative, almost surreal solution. They decided to make him the sovereign ruler of his own miniature kingdom, the island of Elba. The Treaty of Fontainebleau gave him full sovereignty over the island, an income, and a personal guard of a few hundred veteran soldiers. The man who had ruled a continent was now the emperor of an island 12 miles wide. You watch him arrive on Elba. At first, he seems listless and depressed, contemplating his fall from such great heights. But his restless energy cannot be contained for long. He seems constitutionally incapable of being idle. And so, you witness one of the most bizarre and almost comical episodes of his life. Napoleon, the Emperor of Elba, sets about reforming his tiny kingdom with the same manic energy he once applied to all of Europe. This is our wonderfully quirky detail for the evening. He immediately begins a whirlwind of activity. He designs a new flag for Elba white with a red stripe, adorned with 3 golden bees. He reorganizes the island's iron mines to make them more profitable. He builds new roads and improves the hospitals. He modernizes the island's agriculture and sanitation systems. He holds formal court receptions in his modest palace, the Palazzi di Uli, enforcing the same strict etiquette as he did in the Tuileries. He essentially plays emperor on a miniature scale, like a child with a fantastically detailed dollhouse. He is the mayor, the chief engineer, the minister of finance, and the commander-in-chief of an army that could fit in a large theater. His presence on the island, so close to the mainland, made the newly restored monarchies of Europe deeply nervous. This leads to a historical debate. Was the decision to send Napoleon to Elba a foolishly naive act of chivalry, or a calculated but failed attempt to neutralize him? The argument for it being a foolish mistake is strong. The Allied leaders, particularly Sir Alexander, who saw himself as a magnanimous victor, seemed to believe that Napoleon, having been defeated, would be content to live out his days as a retired monarch. They profoundly underestimated his ambition and his enduring popularity in France. Leaving him so close to Italy and France, with his own garden to guaranteed income, was practically inviting him to make a comeback. The alternative view suggests it was more calculated. Some historians argue that certain figures, perhaps even in the Austrian court, the home of his wife Marie-Louise, wanted to keep him as a potential threat in their back pocket. They knew the restored Bourbon monarchy in France under Louis XVI was weak and unpopular. Keeping Napoleon on Elba was a way to keep the Bourbons in check. If they stepped too far out of line, the bogeyman could always be let out of his cage. According to this more conspiratorial view, his escape was not just a possibility, but perhaps even a desired outcome for some factions. You watch as a stream of visitors comes to Elba. His mother, Letizia, and his sister Pauline join in. But his wife, Marie-Louise, and his young son, the former king of Rome, are kept away from him in Austria, a source of great personal pain. He receives secret messages from his supporters in France, telling him that the people are already growing disillusioned with the new king. The army is resentful. The tricolor flag has been replaced by the white banner of the Bourbons, and the freedoms won in the revolution seem to be under threat. He paces the cliffs of Elba, staring across the water towards Corsica, his birthplace, and beyond it, to the coast of France. He grows restless. The game of being a miniature emperor has lost its charm. He knows he has one more roll of the dice left in him, one last audacious gamble. In late February 1815, less than a year after arriving, he slips away from the island on a small brig, the Inconstant, with his 1,000-man guard. The Eagle, as he would proclaim, was about to fly, from steeple to steeple, all the way to the towers of Notre Dame. The 100 days are about to begin. The gentle, almost sleepy, atmosphere of Elba is shattered by a renewed sense of purpose and incredible speed. You are on the southern coast of France, near Cannes, on March 1st. Gillray. Napoleon and his small band of loyal soldiers have just landed. The local authorities are stunned. The monster has escaped his cage. The initial reaction is fear and confusion. By all conventional logic, this venture is suicidal. 1,000 men against the entire French army and the combined might of Europe. But Napoleon isn't relying on conventional logic. He is relying on his own legend, on the personal bond he still shares with the French soldiers and a large part of the population. He immediately begins to march north, taking the daring and difficult route through the Alps to avoid the royalist areas of Provence. This journey becomes one of the most remarkable and dramatic episodes in his life. This is the core historical point. The flight of the eagle, as it's called, was a conquest achieved not with bullets, but with charisma. Napoleon's return was a triumph of personality and propaganda. He presented himself not as a warmonger, but as a liberator, come to save France from the inept and reactionary Bourbon monarchy and to restore the glories of the revolution. He was gambling everything on the hope that the army sent to stop him would not fire on their former emperor. The ultimate test comes a few days into his march, on the road to Grenoble. You are there. A regiment of the 5th Infantry has been dispatched to block his path. They are drawn up in a line across the road, muskets leveled, their faces a mixture of confusion and grim duty. This is the moment of truth. If they fire, the whole enterprise is over. Napoleon's small band of followers halts. He orders his men to lower their own weapons. Then he walks forward alone, slowly, deliberately, until he is within musket range of the royalist troops. He is wearing his famous grey greatcoat. He opens it, exposing his chest, and his voice rings out across the silent field. Soldiers of the 5th, I am your emperor. If there is a man among you who would kill his emperor, here I am. There is a moment of unbearable tension. The soldiers stare at the familiar figure. The young officer in command shouts fire, but his voice cracks. No one moves. A few seconds pass that feel like an eternity, and then a single cry of Vive l'Empereur erupts from the ranks. It's followed by another, and another, until the entire regiment is a cheering, weeping mob. They break ranks, surround him, and join his cause. The first army sent to stop him has become his escort. This moment leads to a fascinating bit of trivia about the power of symbols. As Napoleon's march continued, it gained an almost mystical quality. He had landed without an army, but now an army was flocking to him, and the symbols of his empire, which had been suppressed, began to reappear as if by magic. The tricolor cockadis, the red, white, and blue rosettes of the revolution and the empire had been hidden away when the Bourbons returned. Now, people were pulling them out of their hiding places. There's a famous, perhaps apocryphal, story that the violets blooming in the spring of 1815 became a secret symbol for his supporters, who would ask one another, "Do you like violets?" A yes was a sign of allegiance to Per la Violette, Father Violet, as he was nicknamed, who was promised to return with the spring. The astonishing success of his return, he would enter Paris without a single shot being fired in anger, has led to a fierce historical debate. Was this a glorious popular uprising or the selfish act of one man dragging a weary nation back to war? The romantic narrative, which Napoleon himself carefully cultivated, portrays the 100 Days as a testament to the deep love and loyalty of the French people. They had rejected the backward-looking Bourbons and joyfully welcomed back their true leader, the man who represented French glory and revolutionary progress. In this view, he was not an invader, but was carried back to power on a wave of popular acclaim. The opposing, more cynical view argues that his return was an act of supreme egoism. France was tired of war. It was just beginning to find peace and stability. Napoleon, they argue, for his own personal glory and his refusal to accept defeat, plunged France and all of Europe back into a conflict they did not need or want. They point out that while the army and many common people did support him, much of the country, particularly the middle-class liberals and merchants, was horrified. They saw his return not as a liberation, but as the prelude to another round of bloodshed and economic ruin. They weren't cheering, they were reading what was to come. You follow his triumphant procession to Paris. Marshal Ney, one of his most famous commanders, who had boasted to the king that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, finds his own troops deserting to the emperor. In the end, Ney himself succumbs and rejoins his old master. On March 20th, Napoleon walks into the Tuileries Palace, which King Louis XVII had fled just hours before. He has reconquered France without firing a shot. But he knows, and everyone knows, that this is only the beginning. The Allied powers, meeting at the Congress of Vienna, have already declared him an outlaw, an enemy of humanity. They are assembling their armies once again. The final, decisive battle is now inevitable. It will be fought on a muddy field in modern-day Belgium. The euphoric, almost dreamlike, atmosphere of the march to Paris evaporates, replaced by the damp, heavy air of a Belgian summer. You are on a rain-soaked ridge near a small village called Mont Saint-Jean. It is the morning of June 18th. Yabayau. The ground is a muddy quagmire from a torrential overnight thunderstorm. Below you, across the shallow valley, is another ridge. On it, you can see the red lines of the British, German, and Dutch-Belgian army under the command of a man with a famously large nose and an iron will, the Duke of Wellington. To the east, the Prussian army, commanded by the grizzled old Marshal Blücher, is marching desperately to join the fight. This is the Battle of Waterloo. This is the final act. Napoleon knows he must strike a decisive blow before the full might of the Allied coalition can converge on him. His strategy is simple and classic Napoleon. He needs to defeat Wellington's and Blücher's armies separately before they can unite. He has already engaged the Prussians 2 days earlier at Ligny, defeating them but failing to destroy them. Now, he has turned his full attention to Wellington's army, which has positioned itself on a strong defensive ridge. Napoleon is confident. I tell you, he remarks to his generals, that Wellington is a bad general, the English are bad troops, and this affair is nothing more than eating breakfast. The battle is delayed for several hours because of the mud. This is the core historical point that proved fatal. Napoleon wanted the ground to dry so he could effectively maneuver his cavalry and, most importantly, his devastating artillery. His cannons were his trump card, and their effectiveness was severely reduced in the soggy ground, with cannonballs burying themselves in the mud instead of skipping across the surface. This delay gave the Prussians precious extra time to march to the battlefield. Finally, around 11:30 a.m., the battle begins. You witness a series of brutal, head-on assaults by the French against Wellington's unyielding lines. The fighting is concentrated around 3 key strong points on the battlefield: the fortified farmhouse of Hugeux-Umont on the right, the farmhouse of Lohe-Saint in the center, and the village of Plancenoit in the rear. The battle devolves into a hellish, attritional slugfest. Waves of French infantry march up the muddy slopes, only to be cut down by disciplined volleys from the British infantry squares. One of the most iconic, and frankly bizarre, moments of the battle is the great French cavalry charge in the afternoon. This is our quirky detail. For reasons that are still debated, Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, misinterprets a slight withdrawal of the British center as the beginning of hurrah. He launches a massive, unsupported cavalry charge, sending thousands of armored cuirassiers and lancers surging up the slope against Wellington's infantry. But Wellington's troops are not retreating. They form their famous infantry squares, human fortresses of bayonets. The French cavalry thunder around them, trying to break through, but they cannot. It's a magnificent, glorious, and utterly futile spectacle, like waves breaking against a rock. They charge again and again, but without infantry or artillery support, they are slowly worn down and destroyed. This leads to one of the most enduring debates of the entire Napoleonic era. Why did Napoleon lose at Waterloo? Was he defeated by the genius of Wellington and Blücher, or did he defeat himself? That he lost at camp points to a series of uncharacteristic errors on Napoleon's part. They argue that he was not the same man he had been at Austerlitz. He was suffering from ill health, possibly hemorrhoids, which made sitting on a horse for long periods agonizing, and he seemed lethargic and indecisive at key moments. He delegated too much authority to his commanders, like Ney, who then made critical blunders. His battle plan was uninspired, a series of crude frontal assaults rather than his trademark elegant maneuvers. The day won at camp gives more credit to the Allied commanders. Wellington chose a brilliant defensive position and managed his troops with masterful calm under immense pressure. He trusted his men to stand and fight, and they did not let him down. And crucially, there was the tenacity of the Prussians. Marshal Blucher, despite being defeated and nearly captured just 2 days before, had promised Wellington he would come to his aid. He kept his word. The arrival of the Prussians on Napoleon's right flank in the late afternoon was the turning point. It forced Napoleon to divert his precious reserves, including his elite old guard, to stop them, fatally weakening his final assault on Wellington's line. As dusk begins to fall, you see that final, desperate gamble. Napoleon commits his last reserve, the legendary Imperial Guard, in a final push to break Wellington's center. These are the grizzled veterans who have never known defeat. They march up the ridge in perfect formation, the terrifying sight. But Wellington has prepared for this moment. He has hidden his best troops on the reverse slope, and as the guard reaches the crest, they rise up and unleash a devastating volley at point-blank range. The guard falters. They stop, and then, for the first time in their history, they break and run. The cry goes up through the French army, "La garde recule." The guard retreats. It is the signal for a general collapse. The battle is lost. The French army dissolves into a panicked drought, pursued into the twilight by the victorious Allied cavalry. The dream of 100 days is over. It has ended here, in the mud and carnage of a Belgian field. For Napoleon, there are no more comebacks, no more audacious marches. There is only one final destination left, a remote, windswept chalk in the middle of the South Atlantic. The thunder of the cannons at Waterloo fades into an unnerving silence, broken only by the cry of seabirds and the relentless, monotonous sound of waves crashing against volcanic cliffs. The air is damp, humid, and heavy with the scent of the ocean. You are on Strait Helena, a tiny, remote British island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from anywhere. This is Napoleon's final prison, and it is here that he will fight his last campaign, the battle for his own legacy. After his defeat at Waterloo and second abdication, Napoleon surrendered to the British, hoping for a gentlemanly retirement in a country manor in England. The British government, however, was taking no chances this time. Elba was a country club street. Helena was a maximum security prison. They chose the most isolated, inescapable place they could find. He was sent here not as a retired emperor, but as a prisoner of war, addressed simply as General Bonaparte by his captors, a title deliberately chosen to deny his imperial status. This is the central historical context, the final 6 years of Napoleon's life on street. Helena were a miserable, petty, and deeply psychological war between the fallen emperor and his British jailer, the governor of the island, Sir Hudson Lowe. Lowe was a stiff, bureaucratic, and deeply insecure man, terrified that his famous prisoner might escape. He subjected Napoleon to a series of humiliating and needless restrictions. He censored his mail, restricted his movements, and constantly quarreled over the expenses of his household. The man who had once dictated terms to the emperors of Europe was now arguing with a pedantic bureaucrat over the cost of wine and firewood. You are inside Longwood House, the damp, rat-infested, and windswept residence assigned to Napoleon and his small retinue of loyal followers who volunteered to share his exile. The atmosphere is claustrophobic and toxic, filled with boredom, jealousy, and despair. Napoleon's health begins to decline in the humid, unhealthy climate. He grows heavier, his energy fades, and he spends long hours in his bathtub to soothe his various ailments. The ego is well and truly caged. But in this bleak environment, Napoleon discovers his final weapon. If he can no longer command armies, he can command history. He decides to dictate his memoirs. This is the wonderfully strategic, quirky detail of his final years. Day after day, he gathers his followers, like the Comte de los Cases, and holds them captive with his words. He paces the room, dictating his version of his life story, a carefully constructed narrative designed for posterity. He reframes his entire career. His wars, he claims, were always defensive, forced upon him by the aggressive monarchies of Europe who hated the French Revolution. His ambition was not for personal glory, but for the creation of a peaceful, unified United States of Europe, based on liberal principles. He portrays himself as a misunderstood visionary, a Prometheus bound to a rock, punished for bringing light to the people. He skillfully blends fact with fiction, glossing over his mistakes, exaggerating his successes, and creating a powerful, romantic, and highly influential myth, the Napoleonic legend. His followers transcribe every word, smuggling the pages back to Europe where they will eventually be published as the Memorial of St. Helena. The book would become an international bestseller, a gospel for a new generation of romantics, liberals, and nationalists. This act of posthumous self-creation fuels a major historical debate. Are the memoirs from Street Helena a valuable historical source or just a brilliant piece of propaganda? One school of historians approaches the memoirs with extreme caution. They see them as a deeply unreliable, self-serving document, the final act of a master manipulator trying to control his own image from beyond the grave. They point out the numerous factual inaccuracies, the convenient omissions like the Spanish ulcer or the disastrous retreat from Russia, and the way he consistently shifts blame for his failures onto others. For them, the memoirs are more a study in Napoleonic psychology than in actual history. The other school, while acknowledging the propaganda element, argues that the memoirs are still an invaluable source. They contend that even in its distortions, the memorial reveals what Napoleon wanted people to believe, what he thought was important, and how he understood his own historical significance. They argue that you can't understand the 19th century without understanding the Napoleonic legend, and that legend was born in these dictation sessions at Longwood House. The memoirs, in their view, were not just a reflection of history, but an active force that shaped it, inspiring future revolutions on political movements. You watch him in that gloomy room, his voice still full of authority, weaving the tapestry of his own myth. He knows he is dying. He is in constant pain, which he believes is stomach cancer, the same disease that killed his father, though he also suspects the British might be slowly poisoning him. The battle of words, of legacy, is the only one he has left to fight. On May 5th, at the age of 51, he dies. His last words, whispered in a storm, are reported to be France. France, army, head of the army. A final, jumbled testament to the things that defined his life. But his death would not end the questions surrounding him. In fact, it would open up one final, cynical, and very contentious chapter in the story of his physical reality. The damp, gloomy atmosphere of Longwood House transitions to a stark, clinical setting. The air is still and heavy with a formal, somber silence. You are present at the autopsy of Napoleon Bonaparte, conducted on May 6th, the day after his death. A team of 7 British doctors, along with Napoleon's personal physician, Dr. Autopsy, are gathered around the body. This is a moment of immense political and historical significance. The British need to prove to the world that he died of natural causes, to quell any conspiracy theories of assassination by poison. The procedure is methodical and grim. The doctors examine the body externally and then internally, documenting their findings. The main conclusion, agreed upon by most of the doctors present, is that he died from a severe stomach ailment, very likely a cancerous ulcer that had perforated the stomach wall. This confirmed the cause of death that Napoleon himself had suspected and aligned with his family's medical history. The official report is signed and sent off to London. Case closed. Or so it seemed. But it's within the dry, factual details of this autopsy report that we find the central piece of evidence for our entire investigation tonight. This is the historical fact that should have put the short Napoleon myth to rest forever. As part of the procedure, Dr. Marchai, the French physician, took a final, precise measurement of the body's length. He recorded it in his notes. As we discussed way back at the beginning of our journey, his measurement was 5 peeds, 2 paces, in old French units. When this number was reported in the British press, it was misread as 5 feet, 2 inches, cementing the myth of the tiny emperor. But that was the only measurement taken. You look closer at the scene. One of the British doctors present, a man named Dr. Archibald or Nutt, also noted the height. While there is some confusion in the records, the general consensus points to a measurement that, when converted properly, aligns almost perfectly with Tom March's. The scientific, clinical evidence from the autopsy table is clear. Napoleon was about 5 feet 6, 5 inches tall, roughly 1.16 meters, a perfectly average height for his time. The shortness was a myth born of propaganda and perpetuated by a simple conversion error. This brings us to a wonderfully strange and slightly macabre piece of trivia from the autopsy. During the procedure, in a moment that is still shrouded in some mystery, Dr. March removed several organs, including the heart which was to be given to his wife, Marie-Louise, though she refused it in the stomach. But according to legend and some anecdotal evidence, he also surreptitiously removed something else, Napoleon's penis. From there, this bizarre relic supposedly went on an incredible journey, passing through the hands of various collectors over the next 2 centuries. It was allegedly bought by a famous American urologist in the 1972 and is still in the possession of his family. It has been described by those who have claimed to see it as small and shriveled, resembling a piece of leather or a dehydrated eel. It is a weird, then dignified, and frankly creepy postscript to the life of a man who ruled Europe. The official cause of death, stomach cancer, did not end the speculation. This leads to a historical and scientific debate that has raged for 200 years. Was Napoleon murdered? The assassination theory gained new life in the 1960s when modern scientific analysis of a preserved lock of Napoleon's hair revealed extremely high levels of arsenic. This seemed to be the smoking gun. Proponents of the poisoning theory, led by a Swedish dentist named Sten Forsua argued that the British, with Hudson Lowe as their agent, had slowly poisoned Napoleon with arsenic over a period of years. This would explain his declining health, his specific symptoms, and the high levels of the poison found in his hair. However, the natural causes camp has pushed back strongly. They argue that arsenic was a common substance in the 19th century, found in everything from medicines to wallpaper glue and even wine. They point out that hair samples from Napoleon taken years before he went to street Helena also show high arsenic levels, suggesting he was exposed to it throughout his life, as were many people of his era. They maintain that the autopsy findings of a massive stomach tumor are undeniable physical evidence and that the symptoms he displayed are perfectly consistent with death from stomach cancer, not arsenic poisoning. Was he the victim of a slow, deliberate assassination by the British state, or did he succumb to a hereditary disease in an unhealthy environment? The jury of history is, remarkably, still out. You see the doctors completing their grim work. They have, in their clinical report, their simple, factual numbers that disprove the myth of his height. But they couldn't have known that this fact would be ignored. They couldn't have known that the caricature created by James Gillray and the conversion error in the London newspapers would be far more powerful and enduring than their own scientific measurements. The truth was recorded, But the myth was already too strong to kill, and it was about to take on a life of its own, evolving from a simple physical description into a famous psychological concept. The stark, clinical reality of the autopsy room on street. Helena fades away. We are now moving forward in time, into the 20th century. The world is one of psychology textbooks, leather couches in therapists' offices, and the quiet, analytical language of psychoanalysis. Napoleon the man is long dead, but his ghost, or at least the caricature of his ghost, is about to be given a new and incredibly resilient life in the realm of popular psychology. You are in Vienna in the early 1900s, the intellectual hothouse where Sigmund Freud and his circle are revolutionizing the way we think about the human mind. One of Freud's prominent associates, a man named Alfred Adler, is developing his own theories. Adler is fascinated by feelings of inferiority and how human beings strive to compensate for them. He proposes a concept he calls the inferiority complex, the idea that people who feel inadequate in one area will often overcompensate by striving for superiority in another. This is the key historical moment where our story takes a turn from history to psychology. Adler and his followers needed a powerful, easily understood example to illustrate this theory. And who better than the famous short emperor? The myth of Napoleon's height, by now firmly entrenched as historical fact in the popular imagination, was the perfect case study. The story was simple and compelling. Napoleon was a very short man. This physical inferiority made him feel inadequate. Therefore, he developed an insatiable lust for power, conquest, and glory as a way to compensate for his lack of stature. He wanted to build a giant empire to make himself feel tall. The term Napoleon Complex was born. It quickly entered the popular lexicon as a handy, if deeply simplistic, psychological label. You hear it everywhere. A short man who drives a big, fleshy car. Napoleon Complex. A boss of small stature who is overly aggressive and demanding. Napoleon Complex. The term became a piece of cultural shorthand, a pop psychology diagnosis for any short man who displayed ambition or aggression. It was catchy, intuitive, and completely based on a historical falsehood. This leads to a wonderfully ironic piece of trivia. Modern psychological studies have actually tested the validity of the Napoleon Complex. In 2007, a study in the UK, often dubbed the Wessex Growth Study, examined a group of men over a long period. It found no evidence whatsoever that shorter men were more likely to be aggressive, assertive, or power-seeking than their taller counterparts. In fact, some studies have even found the opposite to be true. The entire psychological concept, which has been used to label and stereotype millions of men for a century, appears to be as baseless as the historical myth it was built upon. It's a myth built on top of a myth, a house of cards standing on a foundation of hot air. The persistence of the Napoleon Complex, both historically and psychologically, raises a debate that touches on the very nature of how we understand history and human behavior. Do we prefer simple, narrative explanations over complex, nuanced realities? One side argues that concepts like the Napoleon Complex are a harmful form of pop psychology reductionism. They take a complex historical figure, driven by a tangled web of personal ambition, historical circumstance, and political ideology, and boil him down to a single, easily digestible, and ultimately insulting caricature. It's intellectually lazy and prevents a real understanding of the past. It also creates a damaging stereotype in the present. The other perspective, while not defending the term's accuracy, suggests that its entrance reveals something important about our need for stories. Humans are narrative creatures. We make sense of the world through stories with clear cause and effect relationships. The idea that short man becomes conqueror to compensate is a powerful, memorable story. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's far more compelling than the messy, multi-causal reality of Napoleon's rise to power, which involves Corsican nationalism, the social chaos of the French Revolution, military genius, political opportunism, and a dozen other factors. In this view, the Napoleon Complex persists not because it's true, but because it's a good story. You can see the appeal. It's a neat little box to put a giant of a man into. It makes him seem less intimidating, more understandable, his monumental ambition reduced to a simple, almost pitiable, psychological tip. The myth that began as British wartime propaganda found a new home, a new life, and a new scientific legitimacy in the world of 20th century psychology. The rumor had successfully shape-shifted, ensuring its survival for another 100 years. And it was about to get another major boost from an even more powerful medium, the silver screen. The quiet, analytical world of the psychologist's office fades to black, and then flickers to life again. You are now sitting in the plush velvet seat of a darkened movie theater. The air smells of popcorn. On the giant screen in front of you, a historical epic is unfolding. There are sweeping vistas, grand ballroom scenes, and epic battles with thousands of extras. And at the center of it all is an actor portraying Napoleon Bonaparte. He is brilliant. He is charismatic. He is tortured. And almost invariably, he is short. We have now arrived at the 20th and 21st centuries, the age of mass media. And no medium has been more influential in cementing the myth of Napoleon's height than cinema. This is the central point of our chapter. For the past 100 years, film and television have acted as a global echo chamber, taking the old British caricature and the pop psychology cliché and broadcasting it to billions of people, solidifying the myth for a new era. You watch as a montage of different cinematic Napoleons flashes across the screen. There's the silent film version from the 1920s, Abel G. Ance's masterpiece Napoleon, which, while artistically revolutionary, still played with the idea of his physicality. Then you see the classic Hollywood epics of the 1950s and 60s. Think of Marlon Brando in Desiree 1954, Rod Steiger in Waterloo 1970. While these actors are not necessarily short themselves, the films often use clever cinematic tricks, low camera angles on his opponents, surrounding him with unusually tall actors, costuming him in ways that make him seem smaller, to visually reinforce the stereotype. The script will inevitably include a joke or a pointed remark about his stature. The character becomes a stock type, the short, angry genius. It's a convenient shorthand for filmmakers. It instantly establishes character and motivation without the need for complex historical exposition. The audience already knows he was short and angry, so the film simply has to play into that expectation. From serious historical dramas to outright comedies like Bill Ted's Excellent Adventure or Night at the Museum, the portrayal is remarkably consistent. Napoleon is a comically small, perpetually furious man with a huge hat and a desperate need to conquer something. This leads us to a fascinatingly quirky detail about the casting of Napoleon in film. One of the most famous examples of playing the myth was the 1941 comedy That Hamilton Woman. The film is about the love affair between the British naval hero Lord Nelson and Lady Hamilton. Napoleon is the villain, and he is portrayed by an actor named Louis Boney, who was only 5 feet 4 inches tall. He is depicted as a stomping, childish tyrant, a perfect visual foil to the tall, heroic Laurence Olivier as Nelson. This kind of casting becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. An actor is chosen because he fits the physical stereotype, and his performance then further reinforces that stereotype in the public mind. It's a perfect feedback loop of misinformation. The persistent portrayal of a short Napoleon on screen has sparked a debate among historians and film critics. Does popular media have a responsibility to be historically accurate, or is its primary duty to entertain? One side argues forcefully that filmmakers, especially those making historical dramas, have a duty of care to the past. They contend that because most people get their history from movies rather than books, inaccurate portrayals can do real damage. By repeatedly showing Napoleon as a short man, Hollywood has effectively erased the historical truth for millions of viewers, replacing it with a lazy and inaccurate cliché. They see it as a failure of historical imagination and research. The other side argues that this is missing the point of cinema. A film is not a history lecture. Its goal is to tell a compelling story, to create drama, and to entertain an audience. Filmmakers use artistic license to condense complex events and create memorable characters. The short Napoleon is, in this view, a useful dramatic device. It provides an instant, visual metaphor for his outsider status and his immense ambition. They would argue that whether he was 5'2" or 5'7" is a trivial detail that doesn't change the fundamental drama of his life. Sacrificing a minor historical fact for the sake of a better story is a perfectly acceptable trade-off. As you sit there in the dark, watching the credits roll on another epic film, you realize the power of this medium. A single, powerful cinematic image can be more influential than 1,000 scholarly articles. The image of a diminutive Napoleon, fist clenched in jaw set, has been seared into our collective cultural consciousness. It's a simple, powerful, and enduring image. And it's completely wrong. The question we have to ask ourselves now is, why? Why has this particular lie been so much more successful, so much more resilient, than the much more complex truth? The flickering lights of the movie theater dim completely. Then we are left in a quiet, contemplative space. We've traced this rumor from its birth in the ink-stained print shops of London, through a botched Autopsy translation, into the halls of psychology, and onto the silver screen. We've proven, pretty conclusively, that it's false. But the biggest question remains, why? Why has this particular myth, the myth of the short emperor, survived so tenaciously for over 2 centuries? Why do we, as a culture, seem to need Napoleon to be short? The answer, I think, lies in the comforting power of a simple narrative. This is our central point for this chapter. The myth of Napoleon's height persists because it serves a deep psychological need. It's a way of taming a figure who is otherwise too large, too complex, and too terrifying to easily comprehend. Napoleon Bonaparte was a true historical giant. He was a man who, through sheer force of will and genius, appended 1,000 years of European history. He redrew the map of a continent, rewrote its laws, and led armies of a scale never before seen. His ambition was limitless, and his impact was world-changing. That kind of figure is unsettling. He breaks all the rules and defies easy categorization. By making him physically small, we symbolically cut him down to size. We contain him. The myth of his shortness provides a simple, almost comical, explanation for his monumental ambition. It domesticates his genius, reducing it to a psychological tick, the Napoleon Complex. It allows us to look at this whirlwind of history and say, oh, I get it. He was just a short guy with a chip on his shoulder. It's a way of finding a simple, human-sized vulnerability in a man who often seems superhuman. It makes him less intimidating, less of an anomaly. It makes him manageable. This brings us to a strange and telling piece of trivia about how we treat other historical giants. Napoleon is not the only powerful figure to be subjected to this kind of mythologizing, often focusing on a physical flaw. Think about the persistent, and largely untrue, stories about Adolf Hitler's supposed physical deformities, or the way political opponents will often mock a leader's appearance, their weight, their gait. It's a timeless political tactic, as old as Gillray's cartoons. Attacking a person's physical attributes is a way to diminish their power and authority without having to engage with their ideas or actions on a substantive level. It's a way of saying, how can you take this person seriously? Just look at them. The focus on Napoleon's height is perhaps the most successful and enduring example of this kind of character assassination in all of history. This enduring need for a short Napoleon highlights a broader debate about the nature of historical memory. Do we remember history as it was, or do we reshape it to fit our own narrative needs? The traditional view of history strives for objectivity. It believes that through careful research and the weighing of evidence, we can arrive at a version of the past that is, as closely as possible, what actually happened. From this perspective, the Napoleon height myth is simply a failure of historical education, a persistent error that needs to be corrected with facts. A more postmodern view of history, however, would argue that a purely objective past is unattainable. We always view history through the lens of our own time, our own biases, and our own cultural needs. In this view, the story of Napoleon's height is, in itself, a historical fact. The fact that the myth exists and has been so powerful tells us more about the cultures that perpetuated it Britain in the 19th century, pop psychology in the 20th than it does about Napoleon himself. The question for these historians is not was he short, but why have we always needed him to be short? The myth becomes an objective study in its own right, a mirror reflecting our own anxieties about power, ambition, and greatness. You can feel the weight of this idea. We've spent this entire journey debunking a myth with facts. The inch verses, the bows, the affectionate meaning of la petite caporal, the autopsy report. But maybe the facts were never the point. The myth isn't powerful because people are ignorant of the facts. It's powerful because it tells a better, simpler, and more psychologically comforting story than the complex truth. It's a story that reassures us that even the greatest men are driven by the most common of insecurities. It's a lie that makes the chaos of history feel a little more orderly. And in doing so, it ironically makes us miss the entire point of who Napoleon really was. So, here we are, at the end of our long journey. We've walked through palaces and across battlefields, from the sun-baked hills of Corsica to a windswept rock in the middle of the ocean. We have deconstructed the myth of the short emperor piece by piece, exposing its roots in propaganda, misunderstanding, and our collective need for a simple story. We have seen that the man at the center of this myth was, in physical reality, entirely average. But in every other respect, he was anything but. And that brings us to our final, and perhaps most important, point tonight. By obsessing over the trivial and false detail of his height, we risk missing the very real ways in which Napoleon Bonaparte was a true giant of history. His real stature has nothing to do with inches or centimeters. It is measured in the profound and lasting impact he had on the world, an impact that we still live with today. Focusing on the caricature of little Boney is a distraction. It's a comfortable one, a funny one, but it prevents us from grappling with the man's colossal and complicated legacy. Think back to the Napoleonic Code. We saw it being forged. A document that swept away centuries of feudal chaos and established the principle of legal equality. That code, in various forms, still provides the foundation for the civil law systems in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, much of Italy and Germany, and dozens of countries around the world, including the state of Louisiana in the United States. His legal shadow is immense. Think of the administrative and political map of Europe. He rationalized the chaotic patchwork of states in Germany and Italy, inadvertently planting the seeds of nationalism that would lead to their unification later in the century. The systems of centralized government, of prefects reporting to a central authority, the establishment of national banks, and the creation of elite technical universities' grand goals. All of these were Napoleonic innovations that shaped the modern state. He was a master of organization, and the structures he built were made to last. This leads us to our final piece of trivia, a small but perfect symbol of his lasting, everyday influence. Have you ever noticed that in most of continental Europe, traffic keeps to the right? There are many theories about this, but one of the most persistent credits Napoleon. Before him, the convention in many places was to keep to the left, a tradition supposedly dating back to medieval times when you wanted your sword arm, your right arm, to be facing any oncoming potential foe. The story goes that Napoleon, being left-handed himself, or perhaps simply for the sake of revolutionary contrariness, ordered his armies and later the civilian populations under his control to march on drive on the right. Britain, which he never conquered, kept to the left. Thus, every time you drive on a road in Paris or Rome, you are, in a very small way, following an order from the emperor. This brings us to our final, overarching historical debate. Was Napoleon ultimately a positive or negative force in history? Was he the last of the enlightened despots, who brought rationality, efficiency, and the best ideas of the revolution to Europe? Or was he the first of the modern, totalitarian dictators, a warmonger whose insatiable ambition led to the deaths of millions and to decades of ceaseless conflict? There is no easy answer, because he was both. He was a modernizer who was also a tyrant. He was a liberator who was also a conqueror. He was a man of the people who crowned himself emperor. He brought legal equality but suppressed political liberty. He was a brilliant, complex, and deeply contradictory figure who embodied both the best and worst of the revolutionary era he sprang from. To try and label him as simply good or bad is to fail to understand him. And so, we end where we began, perhaps back in that quiet room in the Louvre, standing before that enormous painting of his coronation. You look at him again, the central figure in this grand spectacle. The question of his height now seems absurdly, wonderfully pointless. It's a footnote to a footnote. To fixate on it is like judging a volcano by the size of a single pebble it threw. It tells you nothing about the earth-shattering eruption. The true measure of the man is not his distance from head to heel, but his distance from the world he was born into and the world he left behind. By that measure, he was a giant, a figure so tall that he still casts a long shadow over all of us. And so, our journey through this pleasantly pointless piece of history comes to a close. The echoes of cannons have faded, the whispers of the court are silent, and the myth of the small emperor has been gently laid to rest. The story is over, but the quiet of the night is just beginning. Let the details of the past begin to soften and blur, like watercolors bleeding into the page. The names and the dates can drift away now. Napoleon, Wellington, they are just sounds, like the gentle hum of the fan in your room. Feel the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders, replaced by the comfortable weight of your blanket. Imagine that quiet, empty room in the Louvre once more. The vast paintings are just soft, dark rectangles on the walls. The moonlight pools on the polished floor. And you are walking through it, your footsteps making no sound at all. You are drifting now, moving from the world of history and fact into the world of dreams, a place with its own logic, its own landscapes. The arguments of historians, the debates about interests and legacies, they all melt away into a peaceful, quiet stillness. There is nothing left to figure out, nothing left to analyze. There is only the gentle rise and fall of your own breathing, a slow and steady rhythm, like a calm tide on a distant shore. Let each breath pull you a little deeper into that calm, a little further into the soft comfort of sea. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you are ready to rest.